A black janitor daring to show up at my party? This whole hall's going to laugh themselves sick, Charles Whitmore shouted beneath the crystal lights. But then the doors swung open. Naomi Carter appeared, walking straight into the breathless crowd. The contempt he had thrown out was swallowed back by their stunned eyes. In that moment, fake power crumbled, and dignity turned into a weapon. Don't look away. What happens next will ignite your rage and your sense of justice all at once. The Whitmore Tower Ballroom in the heart of Manhattan was flooded with light, crystal chandeliers blazing down onto the pristine white marble floor, where hundreds of guests in luxurious formal wear raised their glasses in celebration. Tonight was the annual gathering of the elite, a night where billion-dollar deals were signed over dinner, and the wealthy flaunted their power. In the middle of the crowd, Charles Whitmore, the host of the event, and the man sitting atop the city's leading real estate empire, raised his champagne glass with a smug grin. His eyes glinted with liquor and arrogance, and his voice echoed across the hall like a dare. I invited the janitor who cleans the city hall hallway to this party, just to see if she'd actually dare show up. The statement hit like a stone on water, rippling into waves of mockery. Laughter erupted instantly. Some guests clapped him on the shoulder, others raised their eyebrows or leaned back in mean-spirited delight. A middle-aged man shook his head with amused approval. Charles, you really know how to stir things up. Cruel but charming. Another voice cut in, dripping with disdain. A perfect little stunt. Drag a lowly life into this place just to give us something to laugh at. The laughter kept rolling, mixing with the clinking of glasses, turning Naomi Carter, an unknown janitor who had never stepped foot in this space, into the night's entertainment, torn apart for laughs. But amid the laughter, a young man with a serious face frowned slightly. He didn't join in. He slowly set his glass on the table and spoke, his voice slipping into a brief silence between the noise. What if she actually comes? The question hung in the air, drawing a few glances toward him. Charles paused for a second, then smirked, his grin growing sharper. He scanned the room, letting the moment stretch for effect, then said with a sneer, "That would be the real show. Nothing more amusing than watching a floor scrubber think she deserves to stand next to us." The laughter rose again, colder this time. A middle-aged woman whispered, her voice like a needle through the air. "I'd pay anything to see that. A nobody thinking she has the right to walk through that door." A few people nodded, some murmurs tangled with the alcohol, forming a toxic wave that spread through the room. In a far corner of the hall, a few reporters invited under the guise of covering the charity event began exchanging looks, quietly communicating. Phones were raised, cameras clicked discreetly. They instantly recognized the kind of moment that could go viral, an open insult, a spark that could ignite controversy if exposed. Charles didn't seem to care. On the contrary, he looked even more pleased seeing the crowd feed off his laughter. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, eyes gleaming with arrogance. "None of you has ever tried this. Taking someone from the bottom of society and dropping them into the most extravagant setting, just to watch them squirm, feel lost, to see them tremble under our gaze. That is real amusement." His voice rang out, blending with the soft music from the live orchestra, the contrast only sharpening the cruelty in his word. Murmurs of agreement rose like waves, heads nodded, and a few sharp-edged laughs sliced through the air. The young man from earlier pressed his lips together, his eyes clearly showing disapproval, but he said nothing more. He knew that in this atmosphere, any protest would be drowned by power and false consensus. Charles was used to having everything he said praised, and that silent compliance only fed his ego. The mocking laughter echoed, stretching like a melody through the hall, turning the elegant atmosphere into a stage of scorn. Naomi Carter, the name tossed around as a joke, became a prop for these well-dressed people to feel superior. None of them imagined that tonight's cruel prank would trigger a chain of events that flipped everything, turning the woman they looked down on into someone the entire city would speak of with admiration. The party went on, glasses refilled, laughter rolled as if nothing serious had happened. But within that laughter, a seed of downfall had been planted, and Charles Whitmore, in his moment of triumph, had sown it with his own hand into the polished marble floor. He had no idea that just a few hours later, that seed would rise like a storm, sweeping away everything he once held in his arrogant grasp. Naomi Carter left City Hall as the night had swallowed the city whole. Her hand trembled slightly from exhaustion after a long shift, cold air seeping through the worn protective jacket. Between the calloused fingers of a 40-year-old woman, a shiny gold invitation glimmered under the streetlight. The reflection off its gilded surface felt like a cruel joke, something alien in the hands more used to brooms and mop buckets. With every step away from the building, she quietly cleaned. Her heartbeat repeated the same question. Why would Charles Whitmore give this to her? Naomi didn't need an explanation. She already knew it wasn't an honor. but an insult wrapped in the glitter of power. In the cramped employee break room, co-workers gathered around when they saw the card. A man with tired eyes and a mocking grin laughed loudly, his voice cutting through the air. "Go on, Naomi. Let's see how hard they laugh in your face. At least you'll get good food and free wine." A woman, quieter but no less sharp, added, "Careful, they don't make a spectacle out of you. Pour wine in the wrong glass, and the whole room will remember you for life." Naomi said nothing, her finger tracing the embossed lettering on the card. She wasn't angry, but a deep chill settled inside her. Those kinds of remarks weren't new. Almost every workday brought stares of condescension. But this was different. This time, the mockery came from one of the city's richest men, sealed in gold leaf, delivered to her like a death sentence for dignity. She walked slowly home through the damp Bronx streets, yellow streetlights casting her long shadow on the cracked sidewalk. Her apartment sat in an old housing block, walls peeling with faded paint. But inside, there was still a flicker of warmth from a dim desk lamp and the smell of a simple dinner lingering in the air. When she opened the door, she saw her young daughter, little Lily, sitting at a wooden table, practicing her writing with worn-down pencils. Hearing her mother, Lily looked up, eyes wide and bright like stars in the night. "Mom, what's that?" Lily asked when she saw the golden card in her mother's hand. Naomi started to hide it, but then changed her mind and placed it on the table. The girl picked it up carefully, turning it under the light and reading the embossed words softly. "Whitmore Tower, Annual Charity Gala." Before Naomi could say a word, Lily looked up again, her innocent eyes filled with questions. "Mom, why did they invite you? And why do they think you don't belong there?" The question cut through Naomi like a blade. After all the years of hard work, she could endure sweat, she could endure silent contempt, but her daughter's eyes and voice brought her to a halt. Lily had never seen the raw cruelty of the world outside, had never felt the pain her mother carried. But tonight, in her gaze, Naomi saw a harsh truth. If she didn't stand up now, her daughter would grow up trapped in the same cycle of quiet humiliation. Naomi bent down, placing her rough hands gently on Lily's shoulders. "Sweetheart, sometimes people look down on others because they think money and status give them that right. But you must remember, a person's worth isn't in their money, it's in how they live." Lily nodded slowly, though her eyes were clouded with sadness. "What if they laugh at you?" she asked, the words light as thread, but weighing heavily in Naomi's chest. She looked down at the card again, and this time her fingers tightened, her heart rising with a strange surge of resolve. She couldn't let that cruel joke crush her pride. If Charles Whitmore and that entire ballroom wanted to laugh, then they would have to laugh with fear in their eyes, because in that very moment, Naomi would walk in and show them that a black woman, a poor janitor, could stand tall and not flinch under their glittering lights. That night, Naomi sat for a long time at the wooden table, silently watching her daughter drift off to sleep. The gold invitation lay on the surface, glowing beneath the small lamp's light, brilliant against the simplicity of the room. In Naomi's heart, a promise took shape. Fate had handed her an insult, she would turn it into a weapon to tip the scales. Charles's joke would no longer be just a joke, it would become an indictment of a class that used others for amusement. Outside, Manhattan still blazed with 1,000 lights. But inside that worn-down apartment, Naomi Carter had made a decision that would change her life. She didn't know what waited ahead, but a fire had been lit, and that fire bore the shape of a mother who would not let go of her dignity, not for herself and not for her daughter. It was late at night, and the streets of the Bronx had sunk into a rare stillness, broken only by the rumble of a late bus trailing a haze of sharp exhaust. Naomi Carter stepped into her small apartment, where every wall bore the stains of time, but still held the warmth of home. Lily had long since fallen asleep, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around a worn-out teddy bear, her breathing steady. Naomi leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, her eyes softening, then stood upright, taking in the narrow room. Her steps led her to the corner cabinet where an old wooden box had been tucked away for years. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, a cloud of dust rising like a breath from the past. Inside the box was a piece of memory Naomi had never forgotten. On top lay a black-and-white photograph of a woman in a striking red dress, smiling proudly, her eyes full of conviction. It was her mother, once a performer on a small community theater stage, who sang with all her heart even when the audience was just a few dozen people packed into a crumbling room. Naomi picked up the photo, her fingers brushing the smile, and for a moment felt like she could hear her mother's voice echoing in her ear. Beneath the photo, the red dress was folded neatly, though faded with time. It still held the shape and spirit of defiance. Naomi lifted the dress, fabric sliding over her hands and making her shiver. She remembered clearly the last night her mother performed, eyes lit with passion as she sang, and the years of illness that followed, forcing her to give up the dream. To Naomi, this red dress wasn't just clothing. It was the inheritance of an unfinished dream, a reminder that some things never truly die, no matter how deeply buried. She held the dress to her body, facing the old mirror in the corner of the room. The reflection staring back was that of a tired janitor in a faded gray uniform, her face worn from years of labor. But when the red fabric draped over her, something shifted in her gaze. She imagined herself walking into the dazzling room of Charles Whitmore, imagined the stunned stares, and imagined the whispers cut short by her very presence. The thought made Naomi's heart race, fear twisting into a strange kind of strength. A soft knock broke the moment. Naomi, startled, quickly set the dress down and opened the door. Her neighbor, Miss Marlene, stood there holding a small box, her eyes kind but sly. "Naomi, I heard all about it. The folks on your shift were talking about that invitation. Are you really going?" Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "I have to. I need to show them I'm not afraid of their joke." Marlene looked at her for a long moment, then smiled and handed over the box. "This is my daughter's makeup kit. Hasn't been used in ages. You'll need it tomorrow night." Naomi offered a soft smile of thanks. They sat together at the old wooden table as Marlene began carefully outlining each feature, brushing every strand of hair into place. Naomi's face slowly transformed. The weary lines were softened with a light layer of powder, and the eyes, once dulled by sleepless nights, were darkened to highlight the strength beneath them. As she worked, Marlene muttered, "They always think we're supposed to bow our heads. But tomorrow night, Naomi, you'll hold yours higher than any of them." Naomi listened, and pride welled up inside her. When everything was ready, Naomi slipped into the red dress. The vibrant color stood out boldly in the modest room, like a flame burning through the dark. She walked over to the mirror and looked at herself. Reflected back was no longer a tired janitor after a night shift, but a woman with bright eyes, a straight spine, and lips curled in a quiet, defiant smile. Naomi took a deep breath, and the fire in her heart surged. Marlene clapped gently, her eyes glistening. "You're the image of your mother. I saw her wear that dress once. And now, Naomi, you're carrying her forward." Naomi placed a hand on her chest, feeling as though her mother's voice was whispering from somewhere deep inside. "Don't be afraid. Walk like a queen." In that moment, Naomi knew her life had turned onto a new path. She would go to the party, not as someone dragged in for others to mock, but as a challenge in human form. And when the crystal lights came down, no one would see a janitor anymore. They would see a hidden queen, awakened after years buried in silence. The Whitmore Tower Ballroom had reached its peak of extravagance. Classical music from the live orchestra echoed through the space, glass clinking blended with bursts of hearty laughter. Cigar smoke curled in the air, and the crystal chandelier lights cast a glow that made everything look like a painting brushed with gold and silver. In the midst of it all, no one expected the silence that would soon slice through. No one imagined that a single entrance could freeze this glittering world in its tracks. The main doors swung open. From the doorway, Naomi Carter stepped in, her stride steady, unhurried and sure. The bright red dress caught the light, setting the entire ballroom ablaze like a sudden fire. Her hair was neatly pinned, her eyes glowing like embers. In that moment, Naomi was no longer a janitor from a worn-down Bronx apartment, but a queen walking through her palace. Every gaze turned to her, and the only thing left in the room was the music stopping abruptly, followed by a silence so thick it stole the air. Spoons and forks dropped to plates, the clatter ringing out like a storm warning. The crowd was stunned, and whispers rushed in all at once. "Who is that? Is that Naomi Carter? No way! The hallway cleaner from City Hall could never." A young woman covered her mouth, eyes wide. "She looks like a star, nothing like the person I thought I knew." As the murmurs tangled together, Charles Whitmore, the man behind the cruel joke, stood frozen, staring at the scene before him. His smug expression collapsed into disbelief, his mouth slightly open. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual pride, now tinged with panic. "Dear God, no way!" The familiar smirk on his lips vanished, replaced with stunned silence. Naomi paused for a few seconds, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Charles at the center. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at her lips. Her voice was calm and clear, but each word cut through his arrogance like a blade. "You invited me, and I came." The short sentence dropped into the space like a verdict, freezing the room in place. A few people gave awkward laughs, but they were weak, strained, nowhere near the confident chuckles from earlier. More eyes began shifting from curiosity to admiration, because in Naomi's stride, there was no trembling. She hadn't entered as someone dragged in for amusement, but as someone who chose to appear, bringing pride and defiance with every step. Charles tried to regain his composure. He shot to his feet, attempting to cover his unease with his usual authoritative tone. "You ... But the words caught in his throat when Naomi's eyes met his. In her gaze was a calmness that made him retreat inwardly, even as he remained standing before the crowd. The murmuring grew louder. Some of the guests whispered that they had never seen Charles interrupted like that, and certainly never by a janitor whose presence alone could silence an entire ballroom. A few younger faces, less tied to old power, even showed a flicker of intrigue, as if witnessing something outside the boundaries of their usual world. Naomi kept walking, each step proud, as if the marble floor had been made for her. Her heart raced, but her face showed no fear. She remembered her promise to Lily, remembered those innocent eyes asking why anyone would think her mother didn't belong, and now, standing in front of those who once treated her as a joke, Naomi's very presence was the clearest answer she could give. The chandelier light poured down, catching the red dress and setting Naomi aglow against the golden backdrop. In that moment, no one could deny it. Her image eclipsed everything else in the room. Charles drew in a deep breath, struggling to regain control. He forced a smirk, but it came out stiff, unnatural. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice tight between clenched teeth. "Do you even know where you are?" Naomi didn't respond immediately. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes drilling into the man who still believed he held all the power. "I'm exactly where you wrote my name to be." The ballroom fell silent again. No one dared speak. Each word Naomi delivered was like a sharp blade, precise, undeniable. Charles might have called it insolence, but he knew full well it was his signature on that invitation, his voice that had boasted about the joke. An older guest cleared his throat, his gaze mixed with curiosity and reluctant respect. A young woman shook her head slightly and whispered, "I've never seen anyone stand up to Charles like that." The whispers moved like waves across the room, from table to table, filling the space with a heavy, charged tension. Naomi knew she had just stepped into dangerous territory, where even the slightest misstep could turn her into exactly the kind of joke they were hoping for, but she also knew there was no turning back tonight. The moment she crossed that threshold, she committed to walking the entire path, whether it ended in triumph or disgrace. There was no panic in her eyes, only a fire rising from deep within, a fire born of being stepped on, looked down upon, and now choosing to stand tall. And that fire had started to spread to the onlookers, making more than a few eyes waver, making Charles Whitmore himself feel, perhaps for the first time in his life, on the losing side of something. In that moment, Naomi Carter was no longer the janitor they were used to seeing in a faded uniform. She was a living act of defiance, the proof of how wrong a power structure could be when it thought a person could be reduced to entertainment. And her presence had opened a door, not just to the ballroom, but to a confrontation that would change everything. The tense silence in the ballroom lasted only a few heartbeats. Charles Whitmore, still standing at the center like a king in his own banquet, suddenly barked out, his voice dry and sharp enough to make several guests flinch. "Who gave you permission to walk in here wearing that dress? This isn't a place for someone like you." His words landed like hammers on the cold marble floor, heavy and deliberate, pounding through air already thick with tension. His eyes flashed with rage, as if Naomi's presence had stained the flawless painting he had so carefully constructed. A laugh broke out from the back, followed by a wave of others. Several women in elegant gowns raised their hands to their mouths, though their eyes gleamed with open scorn. One leaned toward her friend and whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "A janitor trying to be a guest. It's laughable." The murmurs started to swell like a tide, rolling through the entire room. Guests seated near Charles nodded in agreement. Some even clapped lightly, as if they'd just witnessed a piece of entertainment. Naomi stood in the eye of that storm. All eyes were fixed on her, and the chandelier light overhead poured down, making her vivid red silhouette stand out more than ever. Beneath the ridicule, she could sense other gazes, curious, uncertain, even faintly admiring, but they were quickly drowned out by the collective laughter. Charles remained standing, his hands gripping his glass tight, as though his glare alone could crush her. Naomi drew in a deep breath. She could hear the thump of her own heartbeat, but not a single muscle trembled. She lifted her chin, letting her gaze lock onto Charles. As the laughter softened, her voice rose. Not loud, but firm, sharp enough to cut through the thick air. "I clean the filth you leave behind. Tonight, I'm cleaning the way you look at me." For a second, time froze. The laughter vanished. The whispers fell silent, and the ballroom plunged into such stillness that the sound of shallow breaths became audible. Eyes that had moments ago sparkled with mockery widened in disbelief. A janitor, someone they had all dismissed as dust beneath their heels, had just spoken a sentence sharp enough to slice through the pride of the entire room. Charles froze, his lips tight, face flushed red. No one had ever dared speak to him like that. At events like this, he was always the center, the one who humiliated others to assert control. But now, at his own party, the woman he meant to turn into a joke had turned the blade on him, in front of everyone. An older guest let out a quiet cough, then lowered his head as if to hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. A younger woman dropped her hand from her mouth, her eyes now gleaming with interest. The atmosphere seemed to crack open slightly, creating a space Naomi filled with her calm presence. Charles gripped his wineglass so tightly his fingers turned pale, then slammed it onto the table, the glass clinking sharply. He meant to say more, but the words caught in his throat. He knew that anything he said now would be measured against what Naomi had just said. The more he fought back, the more he'd reveal a weakness he had never shown anyone. In those few seconds, Naomi had claimed the stage. She didn't have to raise her voice or make a scene, but every word, every look, every breath declared that she wasn't there for pity. She was there to confront, and it was that confrontation that unsettled those who had joined in the laughter just moments ago. They glanced at one another, their laughter fading into a silence thick with discomfort. Charles Whitmore's elegant evening had just been torn apart by a single, clean line, one that echoed like thunder. And in the eyes of many, for the first time, his power no longer seemed untouchable. It had been challenged, ripped open, by someone he had once considered the lowest of the low. The air now felt like a tightly strung wire, ready to snap at the slightest movement. Everyone waited to see whether Charles would strike again to reassert control, or let her words hang there like an unfinished verdict. Naomi remained where she was, her gaze steady, a faint smile still resting on her lips, as if she knew she had just taken the upper hand in this uneven battle. The entire ballroom stood still, and in that moment, Naomi Carter was no longer just a woman walking in to defy a joke. She had become the embodiment of resistance itself, a living testament that dignity can blaze even in the heart of power. And it was that light that made those who once laughed now lower their eyes, unable to meet hers again. The atmosphere in the banquet hall, already heavy after Naomi's sharp reply, suddenly exploded when Charles Whitmore roared. His face turned red, eyes bulging with fury, and his voice thundered like a command he often used to berate employees or crush the weak. "Security! Get her out of here right now!" The order sliced through the air, sending several security guards in black suits rushing forward. Some guests flinched, wine glasses trembling in their hands, and a few women covered their mouths, fearing chaos was about to erupt in the middle of the lavish gala. Naomi did not flinch. In that tense moment, she reached into her small clutch, pulled out a gleaming gold invitation catching the chandelier's light, and raised it beside her face. The reflection drew every eye, and her voice rang out, clear and powerful, each word striking like a hammer against Charles's arrogance. "You invited me. Are you afraid of your own joke?" Silence fell for a few seconds. Then whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire across the tables. A prominent guest near the stage, Senator Walter Graham, a heavyweight in political circles, slowly stood up. He adjusted his glasses, eyes fixed on the invitation Naomi held. In the wavering atmosphere, his voice rang out, deliberate and firm. "That invitation is real. I recognize your signature, Charles. What have you done?" His words landed like a thunderclap, freezing the entire room. The murmurs ceased. What remained was a suffocating tension. The presence of a figure as powerful as Walter Graham ignited a new wave of reaction. Some distinguished guests sat slack-jawed, and others turned to each other with confusion. Charles suddenly found himself cornered. Every eye locked onto him, no longer with admiration or polite smiles. What remained were stares of judgment, suspicion, and furrowed brows of disapproval. The murmurs returned, this time louder, rising across the room like an unstoppable tide. "Oh my God, he really invited her?" one man whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief and disdain. At another table, a woman clenched her silk fan tightly and hissed, "What kind of joke is this? Bringing a janitor to a charity gala to humiliate her." Another chimed in, "Did he think we'd all laugh with him?" The whispers tangled together, thousands of sharp needles piercing into Charles. In the crowd, a few scoffs broke out, this time no longer aimed at Naomi, but directly at the man who had once been the center of the evening. An elderly businessman leaned toward his companion, speaking just loudly enough for others to hear, "Whitmore, you've brought yourself down." A woman in an opulent gown curled her lip, her eyes filled with contempt as she glanced straight at the host. Every stare, every smirk became a small blade, slicing into the mask of power Charles had worn for so long. Charles swallowed hard, trying to maintain his authoritative posture, but the veins in his neck bulged, and his grip on the wineglass made it tremble in his hand. Inside, a storm of fury and humiliation rose like nothing he had ever felt. Never before had he been cornered like this. Never before had a woman dared stand in the middle of his event and challenge him before the elite. And yet, what he thought was a joke had clearly turned into a trap swallowing him whole. Naomi still stood tall, holding up the invitation, her gaze cold and unyielding, locked on Charles. She didn't need to shout or step forward. With just a small gesture and one simple sentence, she had shifted the course of the entire night. Tonight was no longer Charles Whitmore's night. It was the moment he was betrayed by his own game. Every whisper, every frown, every scoff pounded against the arrogant wall he had built, wave after wave. The murmurs grew louder, thick like a hive of angry bees. Someone shook their head in disgust. Pathetic, a rich man using a dirty trick for fun. Another voice followed, sharp and indignant. This is an insult to all of us here. Then came another round of bitter laughter, this time clearly aimed at Charles, a cutting, icy sound that made his face flush, as if blood had rushed up all at once. In Charles's mind, memories of power flooded back. He recalled standing at podium, greeted by thunderous applause, and remembered banquets where people pushed forward just to toast him. All of that now faded, replaced by scorn and mockery. He felt as though the marble floor beneath him was cracking, as if the wall of honor he had built over the years was collapsing in a single night. Naomi slowly lowered the invitation, her voice calm, yet sharp, echoing through the stifling space. You can command others, you can buy silence, but you cannot erase the truth. You invited me, and I came. Your joke is over. Her words struck like a final blow, cutting straight into Charles's pride. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The mocking laughter around the hall continued, each sound slicing through the mask of power he had worn for far too long. He felt his hands trembling, his heart pounding as if it would burst from his chest. Charles stood there, surrounded by those who once praised him, yet the power that had shielded him now lay shattered, exposing nothing but vulnerability, weakness, and shame. Outside the towering glass windows, the night wind blew hard, velvet curtains swayed gently, as if even the space itself bore witness to this bitter reversal. The background music had faded without notice, leaving only whispers, scattered laughter, and a heavy silence, thick disdain. All of it transformed the Whitmore Gala, once meant to flaunt wealth and influence, into a public courtroom where the most powerful man stood trial beneath the harsh eyes of those who once bowed to him. In that moment, Naomi was no longer simply an uninvited guest. She became a mirror reflecting the truth, a truth Charles Whitmore, with all his wealth and status, could not hide. And from that point on, everyone in the hall understood that the game had ended, not because Naomi walked in, but because Charles's own arrogance had become the verdict he could not escape. Charles Whitmore stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, his face flushed red, veins bulging across his forehead. Never before had he felt this cornered, especially not at a party where he was supposed to hold all the power. The laughter aimed at him, the murmurs, the scrutinizing stares all felt like a blinding spotlight. In a flash, pride turned into blind rage, and he shouted, his voice hoarse with fury, "Call the police now. I won't let this circus go on another second." The command cracked through the air like a whip, but many could hear the tremble in his voice, the kind that revealed a man losing his footing. A side door burst open, and cold night air rushed in. Two figures in deep blue uniforms stepped forward, their boots hitting the polished marble floor with slow, deliberate weight. Officer Blake, broad-shouldered with a square, hardened face, and Officer Rowan, younger, eyes sharp as glass, both carried the kind of presence that came from using authority to dominate. The click of their leather shoes echoed across the room, louder than the string music still lingering, forcing the musicians to fall silent. A ripple of quiet spread from the back of the hall all the way to the center as every eye turned toward the men who had just entered. Blake scanned the ballroom, a slight smirk pulling at the edge of his face. When his gaze landed on Naomi Carter, standing tall in her red dress, the smirk turned into a crooked, disdainful curl. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice loud and deliberate, each word meant to reach every corner of the room. "A black woman in a red dress here? Show your ID immediately." The tone wasn't just official. It dripped with open insult, a declaration that, to them, Naomi never belonged in a place like this. Naomi took a long breath, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares on her. Some looked on and others waiting for a spectacle, and a few blinked with quiet sympathy. In the suffocating tension, Naomi calmly reached into her small purse and pulled out the golden invitation. Under the crystal chandelier, it gleamed, embossed edges, the unmistakable signature of Charles Whitmore clear under the light. She raised it beside her face, and her voice rang out, steady and resonant like a bell. "This is my invitation, signed by Charles Whitmore himself." Rowan scoffed, his cold eyes flicking at the card without really looking. He waved his hand dismissively, his voice dripping with arrogance, as if reading from a sentence already decided. "Don't fake it. Someone like you doesn't belong here. Your place is out on the street, not under these lights." Blake joined in, his words hissing through clenched teeth, leaving no doubt about the contempt behind them. "Red or black, it doesn't change the truth. You can wear a dress and paint your lips, but the shadow of a janitor will always follow you." The officer's words landed like hammers, not just on Naomi, but on the entire ballroom. Many guests were stunned, some unable to believe what they had just heard. A young woman in a shimmering silver dress raised her hand to her mouth and whispered to her friend, "Did they really just say that? Here, in this place?" An older businessman, known for his caution, shook his head slowly, his voice gravelly. "This is blatant abuse of power. Nothing short of public humiliation." At first scattered, the murmurs quickly built into a steady wave, rolling from table to table. Naomi stood tall, her spine like steel, eyes locked on Blake and Rowan. She knew they weren't there to maintain order, but to act as tools for Charles to salvage his pride. Yet she also knew the truth was in her hand. She gripped the invitation tightly, her steady gaze sending a chill through more than a few in the crowd. In front of 2 blue uniforms and hundreds of eyes, Naomi didn't flinch. She understood that if she lowered her head, it wouldn't just be her own defeat. It would be a defeat for everyone who had ever been looked down on, ever been stepped over. Behind her, Charles stood with arms crossed, his face lit with satisfaction as he saw the police on his side. He believed Naomi would break, that light and power would crush whatever fragile pride she carried. But what he didn't see was how each degrading word was making the crowd waver. Phones were being raised quietly, tiny cameras capturing every word, every movement. The soft tapping of keyboards echoed faintly. Social media was beginning to fill with images, with witnesses. The atmosphere in the ballroom had clearly shifted. If people had laughed when Naomi first entered, that laughter had now changed direction. The murmurs carried a tone of outrage, quiet indignation spreading like an undercurrent. A few younger guests, less entangled in Charles's circles, exchanged glances, then nodded subtly, as if acknowledging that the truth could no longer be ignored. Naomi held the invitation a moment longer, high enough for all to see the gleaming gold lettering. Her voice rang out, not loud, but strong, cutting through the silence like a blade. This is the proof. You can ignore it. You can try to crush it, but you can't erase the truth. I was invited, and I came. Charles's joke is over. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Naomi's words weren't just for the officers. They were for everyone. For Charles, who had started the joke, for those who had laughed with him, and for those who stayed silent out of fear. And in that moment, something shifted in the air. The eyes that once followed Naomi with ridicule now looked at her with a vague, growing sense of respect. Blake clenched his fists, but didn't take another step. Rowan pressed his lips together, his expression briefly uncertain. They couldn't deny the truth that stood plainly before them, couldn't dismiss the invitation everyone had seen, but they also couldn't back down, because doing so would mean openly exposing their own abuse of power. The standoff made the air even heavier, thick tension. The crowd, once used to nights filled with wine and praise, now felt pulled into a living courtroom. The murmurs continued to echo, growing louder, rising like waves crashing on shore. And in that tide, for the first time, Charles Whitmore was no longer shielded by the illusion of absolute control. He was seen, exposed, and questioned. In the blazing red light reflecting off her dress, Naomi Carter stood tall, unyielding. She had become a symbol of defiance, of dignity that would not be crushed, and everyone present could feel it, even if they hadn't yet found the words to say it. A turning point was taking shape before their eyes. A fire had been lit, and nothing could put it out. The air in the ballroom remained thick under the weight of the 2 officers in blue, but Naomi Carter stood upright, her small frame in the red dress radiating a strength that was hard to explain. All the insults, all the sneers, none of them made her flinch. On the contrary, it ignited a fire inside her, force that surged through every cell in her body. She slowly lifted her head, locking eyes with Officer Blake and Officer Rowan. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp like forged steel. "You think the color of my skin decides where I belong?" That question wasn't directed at just the 2 officers. It sliced through the dense air of the room like a blade, tearing open the fabric of pretense. Hundreds of eyes shifted. Some guests swallowed hard. Others looked down, whispers spreading quickly but not loud enough to drown out the words just spoken. No one answered, because there was no answer that could stand against the harsh truth Naomi had just exposed. Naomi slowly raised the invitation card. Under the brilliant glow of the crystal chandelier, every line of Charles Whitmore's signature was unmistakably clear, every embossed seal gleaming. "This is evidence," she said, her voice steady, each word echoing across the ballroom. "This is an official invitation, not forged, not fabricated." He signed it. "I'm not here to beg, I'm here to respond to a public invitation." The entire room went silent. The only sound left was the pounding of hearts in strained chests. Blake and Rowan hesitated, their cold expressions faltering. Dozens of guests had already raised their phones. Cameras pointed like sharp eyes at the unfolding scene. The heavy silence lingered for a few more beats, then was broken by a woman's voice. From the left side of the hall, a young woman in a dark suit stood up. It was Amanda Price, investigative reporter for the New York Herald. Her eyes gleamed, one hand holding a small camera high above her head. Her voice rang out, firm and final, like a judge's gavel. "We recorded everything." Instantly, flashes exploded across the room, lighting up every edge of Naomi's red dress, every tight line on Charles's face, every sneer on the officers' mouths. Cameras came to life, shutters snapping like 100 torches flaring all at once. The ballroom, once built to flaunt power and luxury, had become a courtroom, where every hidden corner was now exposed under unrelenting light. Charles Whitmore was frozen. He stood motionless, the wineglass trembling violently in his hand. The face that had burned red with rage had turned pale, his forehead dotted with sweat. He knew everything had just spiraled out of control. The joke he had set in motion, the one he believed would drown the room in laughter, had now turned into a scorching slap across his face, and not just in front of a few hundred guests, but before the entire city, because those recordings would undoubtedly spread like fire through dry forest. The whispers were no longer discreet. They broke open into waves of outrage. My God, it really is his signature. A disgrace, using a person as the punchline. Does Whitmore think he's untouchable? A few let out dry, bitter laughs. But this time, none were aimed at Naomi. They struck directly at Charles, each sound sharp like hundreds of blades slicing through the mask of arrogance he had worn for so long. Naomi still stood tall, faint smile resting on her lips. In that moment, she not only defended her own dignity, but she became a mirror, forcing the entire room to face the truth. The camera flashes lit her face, casting an image both proud and unshaken. She didn't shout, didn't plead, didn't turn away. She stood firm like a landmark, proving that self-respect, when cornered, could flip the entire board. Charles wanted to protest, to scream that this was twisted, to call more people to drag Naomi out of the room, but he knew any word he spoke now would only make things worse. Every sound, every gesture was being recorded, soon to become evidence that could not be denied. In that instant, he felt the collapse threading through every crack in the world of power he had spent a lifetime building. The crowd, once full of people who mocked Naomi as she walked in, now looked at her with different eyes. They saw in her a kind of courage they weren't sure they themselves possessed. Some lowered their head, ashamed for having joined in the laughter earlier. Others looked up, quietly awed, because before them stood not a janitor turned joke, but a strong woman who had tilted the balance of power with nothing but the truth. The room surged with energy, unstoppable now. Charles Whitmore, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city, stood powerless for the first time in his life, undone in the middle of his own celebration, turned from host into spectacle. And Naomi Carter, with a single question, a single invitation card, and an unshakable pride, transformed this evening into a public reckoning where justice spoke in the light of truth. That question wasn't only aimed at the two officers. It tore through the suffocating air in the room like a blade slashing across a false curtain. Hundreds of eyes shifted. Some guests swallowed hard. A few looked down, whispers breaking out in a rush, but none strong enough to bury the words that had just dropped. No one answered, because no answer could stand against the harsh truth Naomi had just exposed. The air seemed frozen for a few seconds, then cracked open into waves of silent tension. Naomi slowly raised the invitation. Under the dazzling light of the crystal chandelier, Charles Whitmore's signature was clear, each embossed seal shining. "This is proof," she said, her voice steady, each word echoing through the hall. "This is an official invitation, not forged, not made up." He signed it. "I'm not here to beg. I'm here in response to a public invitation." Every word landed like a hammer against the wall of arrogance Charles had built, while at the same time carving out a path for the entire room to face the truth. The ballroom fell silent. The only sound left was the thudding of hearts in tight chests. Blake and Rowan hesitated, struggling to hold their icy composure. Their eyes flickered because clearly this had gone far beyond a simple security check. All around them, phones were lifted high in guests' hands like glowing eyes fixed on them. Each beam of light seemed to burn through the air, capturing every detail, every frown, every movement. The silence held for a few beats, then was split by a woman's voice. From the left side of the room, a young woman in a dark suit rose sharply to her feet. Her eyes sparkled, one hand raised with a small camera. She declared, "We got all of it on tape. It was Amanda Price, investigative reporter for the New York Herald." Her voice rang out, firm and final, like the slam of a gavel. Immediately, camera flashes erupted across the room, lighting up every edge of the red dress, every line of tension on Charles's face, every sneer from the two officers. Dozens of cameras clicked to life, their lights flaring like hundreds of torches igniting at once. The ballroom, once designed to flaunt power and luxury, had become the scene of a public trial, where every hidden corner was now lit up under the blinding truth. Charles Whitmore stood frozen. The wineglass in his hand shook violently. His face, once flushed with rage, had gone pale, his forehead damp with sweat. He knew it was all slipping beyond his control. The joke he had engineered, the one he thought would fill the ballroom with laughter, had turned into a burning slap across his face. And not just in front of a few hundred guests, but the entire city, because those recordings would spread like wildfire through a dry forest. The whispers were no longer hushed. They erupted, crashing into waves of outrage. My God, it really is his signature. What a disgrace. Using a person as the punchline of a joke. Does Whitmore think he's untouchable? The sound came fast and sharp, like a waterfall breaking through, drowning out the silence that had once been Charles's ally. A few people let out scoffing laughs, but this time, the laughter wasn't for Naomi. It cut straight at Charles, sharp as 100 blades slicing through the mask of arrogance he had worn for so long. Naomi still stood tall, her back straight, faint smile on her lips. In that moment, she didn't just defend her own dignity, she became a mirror, forcing the entire room to face the truth. The flash of cameras lit her face, casting her in an image both proud and defiant. Her heart was pounding, but she didn't tremble. All the contempt that had pressed down on her earlier had transformed into a silent strength, holding her steady like a landmark carved in stone. Charles wanted to protest, wanted to scream that this was all misrepresented, wanted to call more men in to drag Naomi out of the room, but he knew that any word he uttered now would only make things worse. Every sound, every gesture was being recorded, soon to become undeniable evidence. His mouth felt dry, his heart raced wildly, and his hands shook beyond his control. In that moment, he could feel the collapse creeping into every crack of the empire he had spent his life building. The crowd, which had once laughed when Naomi walked in, now watched her with different eyes. In her, they saw a kind of courage many of them weren't sure they possessed. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of having laughed along at first. Others lifted their chins, quietly awed by the truth that stood before them. Not a janitor mocked for sport, but a woman who had overturned the balance of power with nothing more than the truth. Outside the glass windows, the night wind howled through the trees, the silk curtains stirring as if echoing the storm unraveling inside. The room had turned volatile, and there was no stopping it now. Those who had stayed silent began to speak, their voices ringing clear, each word like a knife plunging into what was left of Charles's pride. He, once the wealthiest and most powerful man in the city, stood powerless at his own party, transformed from the ruler into the punchline. Naomi Carter, with a single question, an invitation, and a pride that could not be shaken, had turned this lavish gala into a public trial, where justice spoke not with outrage, but with the brilliance of truth. And from that moment on, no one would remember the luxury of the room, only the image of a woman, unassuming, resolute, who stood firm and flipped the entire game with the sheer force of self-respect. Naomi Carter stood beneath the blinding flash of dozens of cameras, but instead of stepping back, she moved forward. Her heels tapped steadily against the marble floor, each step thickening the already suffocating air. She walked straight toward the podium at the center of the hall, a platform used until now only to introduce sponsors and recite praises for Charles Whitmore. The entire ballroom held its breath. A few guests made a move to stop her, but let their hands fall, because her resolute gaze told them no force could halt these footsteps. When Naomi placed her hand on the edge of the podium, a wave of whispers rippled through the room like wind through trees. Everyone waited to hear what she would say. Naomi stood tall, took a long breath to steady herself, and then her voice rose, not loud, but ringing clearly across the hall. I've cleaned this very hall for years. Every stone beneath your feet has carried the weight of my sweat. A few heads lifted, their expressions tinged with surprise. She paused, her eyes sweeping over the tailored suits, the glittering diamonds, before locking onto Charles, still frozen with shame and anger. Every night, after you all left, I walked these long hallways, picking up pieces of trash, scrubbing away stains, so that the next morning, you could return thinking this place glowed on its own. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for anything. But I know one thing for certain, my worth has never been recognized. The room fell completely silent. Naomi continued, her voice now lower, tinged with a quiet ache, though her gaze never wavered. Have you ever wondered whose hands wiped the mud off your shoes, or who got down on their knees to clean up after you spilled your wine? Have you ever thought about the people who do this invisible work, so you can shine in a spotless space? An older woman at the front table lowered her head, while a young man silently tapped notes into his phone. Naomi paused, her eyes glowing with a fire forged over years of silence. I used to believe being quiet was enough, that if I just did my job, I'd earn respect. But today I've realized, silence is exactly why people like me become the punchline, and I refuse to stay silent any longer. The sentence dropped like a bell toll, and a few in the crowd gave slow, thoughtful nods. She slowly placed the golden invitation on the podium, her voice stronger now. They said I didn't belong here, but I'm the one who's kept this place worthy of welcoming important guests. If you think value lies in a gown or a glass of expensive wine, then you've forgotten that everything you enjoy stands on the backs of people whose faces you don't bother to remember. Her words stirred the room. From the back of the hall, a few hesitant claps broke the stillness. Isolated at first, but quickly joined by others. Naomi paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, her voice now deeper, steadier, and stronger. I didn't come here asking for pity. I came to reclaim the respect every human being deserves. And if there is any fairness left in your hearts, then acknowledge that, right now, right here. From the left side of the room, a young guest stood up and clapped loudly. The sound spread like fire through dry brush, and more hands slowly joined in. Under the continued flashes of cameras, Naomi Carter stood no longer as a silent floor cleaner, but as a voice that could not be shut down. The truth coming from her lips had cut through the false shine, exposing the unfair power dynamic that had long gone unchallenged. And in that moment, even as Charles Whitmore tried to steady himself, even as Officers Blake and Rowan remained still and stern, all three of them knew the tide had turned. Naomi was no longer the target of ridicule. She was now the center, a beacon shining light on truth no one could dim. Naomi looked down at the polished marble beneath her feet, her eyes gleaming with pride mixed with bitterness. She raised her voice, each word dropping with the weight of a hammer, echoing through the opulent hall. My sweat has touched this marble more than your shoes ever have. The sentence sliced through the room's polished illusion like a blade, a direct blow to the pride that had ruled here for too long. The image of expensive leather shoes suddenly felt fragile, insignificant, when held up next to the figure of a woman who had bent low, soaked in chemicals, to keep those very floors spotless. That blunt comparison flushed many faces, not out of anger, but from a creeping sense of shame. A man who often bragged about his contributions to the city's prosperity now lowered his head, remembering how many times he'd staggered drunkenly and spilled wine, only to find the floor spotless the next morning, never once wondering whose hands had cleaned it. A woman seated near the front row gripped her clutch tightly, recalling the late nights she had left the building, passing the quiet figure sweeping behind her, never once offering a word of thanks. The air thickened, held in place by a truth too heavy to ignore. Then suddenly, from the back of the hall, a single clap rang out. The sound was crisp, deliberate, breaking the silence and turning heads. A young man in a slightly oversized suit stood upright, eyes bright, clapping with both hands. He didn't care about the stares, didn't flinch under the judgment. He just kept clapping, steady and sure. In that moment, the sound seemed to strike a spark, stirring hesitant hearts into motion. Just a beat later, another round of applause rose from the far right corner. Then a few more followed, scattered but resolute. Those who had hesitated at first began to trade their silence for support. The sound gradually spread, like the first drops of rain falling one by one, merging into a heavy downpour. The entire room erupted in thunderous applause, no longer scattered, no longer hesitant. It was unified, powerful, echoing against the high ceilings of the grand hall. Naomi's eyes shimmered with emotion, but she kept her face composed, allowing herself to listen to the chorus of human hearts. That applause was not just for her. It was an awakening, an acknowledgement that the truth had reached them. Those who had only ever nodded along with power could no longer sit still, because they now saw something undeniable, that within her words was a lifetime of devotion, long overlooked. Charles Whitmore sat frozen, his face drawn tight. He realized this ovation was not his, and never had been. Years of crafting a luxurious image, of staging lavish parties, all vanished with a single sentence from the woman he once dismissed. The crowd's respect had shifted, and all he had left was a hollow gaze, alone in the glittering empire he had built. Meanwhile, Naomi stood tall, taking a deep breath as the wave of applause washed over her like a cleansing tide. It was the moment she knew her voice had transcended her position, risen above mockery, and become something collective. In a room that had only known hollow praise, it now echoed for the first time with the sound of undeniable truth. And in that echo, Naomi Carter rose to a new place. Not the humiliated, but the one holding the scales in a battle once thought unwinnable. Amid the thunderous applause filling the banquet hall, Charles Whitmore forced himself upright. His face flushed crimson, eyes blazing with fury. He roared, his voice cracking with rage. "This is still a farce!" The shout echoed, but it no longer had the power to drown out the crowd. It sounded hollow, flailing, like the desperate cry of a man sinking into the swamp of his own making. The loss of control in every gesture laid bare for all to see. The king of the evening had lost his throne in the very palace he built. As the shout faded, heads turned, some with furrowed brows, others shaking their heads in disappointment. A group of business associates near the central table exchanged glances, then slowly stood. No declaration was needed. The simple act of stepping away from the lavish wine table spoke volume. Chairs scraped harshly against the marble floor, each screeched like a blade slicing through Charles's pride. The same people who once shook his hand, who once toasted under golden chandeliers, now walked away in silence, leaving behind only cold stares like a silent verdict. Charles froze, gripping his wine glass as his hand trembled. He forced a crooked smile, but his face twisted with strain. "Can't you see? This is all staged to humiliate me." She was hired, a pawn of jealous people, he said, his voice hoarse. But no one responded. His denial dropped into the chill of the room like a stone. What remained were whispers of disillusionment, eyes filled with suspicion and contempt. A longtime associate, who had collaborated with Whitmore on many ventures, set his glass down, sighed, and said softly, just loud enough for others to hear, "I expected a leader, not a showman." The words reverberated through the air, heavier than any outcry. They made those still seated lean back, distancing themselves from the chaos Charles had created. He was no longer the center they could orbit around, but a pit everyone now avoided. Naomi still stood at the podium, her gaze cast downward, saying nothing. She didn't need to speak. Charles was unraveling all on his own. Every shouted word, every furious motion stripped him of the last remnants of respect. The evening meant to celebrate his name, and power had become a record of his downfall. Under the continuing bursts of camera flash, the image of Charles Whitmore, distorted face, broken voice, exposed isolation, would be one the city would not forget. In a shadowed corner, a few staff members exchanged quiet glances, no longer filled with fear, but with a hint of satisfaction. They understood that this moment wasn't just the fall of a powerful man, but a reckoning for all who had endured his contempt. The applause from earlier, though fading, now returned in scattered bursts. Not to cheer, but to drown out the final, feeble cries of Charles in a sea of sound. He still stood there, hands trembling, wanting to shout back, to reclaim control, but there was nothing left to hold on to. His partners had walked away, those who once praised him were now silent, and the entire room waited only to see what would follow after the arrogant mask had fully crumbled. Charles Whitmore, once a titan of real estate, a commanding host, now remained only as a faltering figure caught in an irreversible collapse. The camera flashes kept blinking, but this time, they were no longer aimed at Charles Whitmore. Every lens now turned toward Naomi Carter, following her every move, capturing her upright stance and unwavering gaze, recording her faint but proud smile, turning her into the undeniable center of the night. The journalists, who had initially come to cover a charity gala, quickly realized they were witnessing a seismic moment, an evening where every layer of glamour was torn away, revealing raw truth. They crowded near the podium, questions flying fast. "Can you tell us more about your work? What gave you the courage to walk into this room? How do you think society will respond after tonight?" Recorters clicked on in unison, capturing Naomi's every word, every expression, as headline gold. Meanwhile, Charles sat in silence at the central table, once arranged to spotlight him, now reduced to a cold, abandoned seat, holding a man quietly unraveling. No one looked his way anymore. The eyes that used to track his every gesture now avoided him, as if his presence were a heavy shadow dragging down the evening. A few cameras swept past his face, but they no longer carried reverence, only scrutiny, seeking to document the downfall of a man stripped of his power. A party plan to cement his image had, in the end, become a public trial, where society stood up and delivered its verdict of failure. The atmosphere in the grand hall shifted entirely. Where once the laughter of the elite echoed, now stood a forum for truth. People turned away from wealth to listen to a janitor speak of sweat and dignity. A few young guests, originally invited to add glamour to the evening, now sat taking notes as if attending a lecture. Some sponsors had quietly stood up, making their way toward Naomi, ready to engage, ready to hear her story. Every small gesture was another cut into Charles's pride, turning his isolation into a verdict that needed no declaration. Naomi remained composed amid the sea of questions. She did not boast, only spoke with sincerity about the work she had devoted herself to, about her belief that dignity isn't measured by title or wealth. Every word she said drew silence across the room, followed by roaring applause. The press, instead of praising a real estate mogul, now portrayed the image of a woman who stepped out of the shadows and claimed the city's spotlight with truth and courage. Charles slumped in his seat, dazed eyes scanning the room, but everywhere he looked, saw turned backs or eyes full of disdain. He wanted to shout, to reclaim attention, but the roar of interviews and thunderous applause drowned out his voice. All his life, Charles believed he was the center, the one who controlled everything. Yet now, in the very gala he had orchestrated, he had become the forgotten man, a living spectacle for those who once hailed him. And as Naomi held her head high under flashing lights, while he shrank into the shadows at his own table, the downfall of Charles Whitmore was fully realized. Just hours after the gala ended, images and clips of Naomi Carter standing tall before the entire ballroom began circulating on social media. At first, they were just short videos posted by attending guests, but the momentum spread so quickly that it became uncontrollable. Within a single night, millions of views poured in, and hundreds of thousands of shares flooded across platforms. People were captivated by the image of a janitor, dressed in a striking red gown, daring to face the wealthy and powerful, along with two uniformed officers. The footage became living proof of courage. Major news outlets quickly picked up the trend with bold headlines. Janitor confronts billionaire at lavish gala. Naomi Carter's red dress rebellion. International media followed suit, turning Naomi into the focus of debates not only across Manhattan, but beyond U.S. borders. Meanwhile, on Twitter, Instagram, and major forums, a hashtag wave erupted. The phrase red dress was used millions of times in under 24 hours, often accompanied by photos of Naomi with her proud gaze and unwavering stance. Each appearance of the hashtag reinforced the message that discrimination and contempt had gone too far, and that change was overdue. Public outrage extended beyond Charles Whitmore, the initiator of the cruel joke, and turned toward the demeaning conduct of officers Blake and Rowan. Their racially charged remarks were repeatedly quoted, becoming evidence of abuse of power and igniting a wave of online protests. Citizens began taking to the streets holding signs that read, "Respect every worker, dignity has no price," or simply featured a painted image of a red dress. They saw Naomi as a symbol of resistance, a voice that dared to rise for those disrespected daily. Social organizations quickly stepped in, inviting Naomi to speak at conferences and labor rights events focused on anti-discrimination. From a woman working silently in the shadows, Naomi was thrust into the spotlight of a surging movement. Meanwhile, the backlash sent shockwaves through the Whitmore Group. Stock prices plummeted, and many partners announced plans to reconsider their business relationship. Charles's habitual silence no longer sufficed to shield him, and vague attempts at justification only worsened the situation. In contrast, each time Naomi appeared in the media, every heartfelt word she shared was met with resounding public support, with countless comments praising her bravery and pride. What was once seen as a joke had turned into a revolution, and at its center stood the woman who had once been the most overlooked of all. The red dress movement continued spreading into schools, workplaces, and even legislative chambers. Heated debates erupted over the value of labor, fairness, and human dignity. Panels were held, and journalists, scholars, and activists all cited Naomi as an example of the change society urgently needed. The image of her standing at the podium, hand resting on the golden invitation, eyes looking straight ahead, was printed and displayed in many offices and coffee shops, becoming a symbol of defiance and self-worth. Through that growing influence, Naomi was no longer simply a woman in a red dress, but had transformed into a symbol for millions who had been silenced, teaching them that sometimes one act of resilience can ignite the flame to change an entire society. Charles Whitmore sat in his vast office, surrounded by glass walls that once offered a sweeping view of the city he had proudly believed he controlled. But that view no longer filled him with pride. It had become a chilling reminder of everything he was losing. On the large screen directly across from his desk, every major news channel played in rotation, with images of Naomi Carter in her red dress flooding everything from print headlines to live broadcasts. Articles with biting titles like "Charles Whitmore's Joke Backfired" and "Billionaire Exposed Under the Spotlight of Justice" boxed him into a corner with no escape. Whitmore Group's social media accounts were flooded with hundreds of thousands of angry comments, calls to boycott the company's projects, and even demands for his resignation, branding his presence in the business world as a disgrace. The phone in his office rang constantly, but nearly every call carried the same message: partners terminating contract, investors freezing their funding, and those who once bowed to shake his hand now turning away with open contempt. The hands once so accustomed to wielding power trembled as they turned each newspaper page, each article filled with biting mockery and growing rage. He had once believed money could buy everything, even reputation, but this time, every dollar spent on lawyers, media consultants, or PR teams was meaningless. The truth had broken free from containment, and his image was now inextricably tied to an unprecedented public humiliation. While Charles was drowning in crisis, in another direction, the names Blake and Rowan also became a focal point. The clip capturing their derogatory remarks was shared millions of times, each word echoing as living proof of abuse of power and discrimination. Human rights organizations stepped in, filing petitions demanding investigation, while the media scrutinized every detail of the two officers' work history. Numerous witnesses suddenly came forward, recounting instances of unjustified stops, verbal abuse, and even cases of physical force that had once gone unheard. Now, the public seemed to have found the key to unlocking a long-hidden door, and Blake and Rowan were swept up in a storm of condemnation. The city's police department was forced to issue an official statement, promising an internal investigation investigation. In the days that followed, images of the two officers leaving the precinct surrounded by reporters' cameras appeared on every front page. The tension on their faces revealed a harsh truth. The power of the uniform was no longer a bulletproof shield. Attempts by higher-ups to defend them only fueled more outrage, as the public was no longer willing to accept any excuses. The wave of protest expanded beyond social media, spilling into street demonstrations, where signs reading "Justice for All" and images of the red dress appeared in overwhelming numbers. Naomi became the face in direct contrast to corruption, while Charles, Blake, and Rowan stood as living symbols of a decaying power structure. This stark opposition was fully exploited by the media, making every effort to salvage Charles's image seem absurd. He could rebuild towering skyscrapers, but shattered honor could not be reconstructed with steel and glass. Meanwhile, the two officers found themselves increasingly isolated, former colleagues avoiding their name, as if erasing their presence could protect what remained of the system. And so, from one extravagant party, Naomi Carter forced an entire city to reflect on itself, triggering an earthquake not only in the business world, but also within the ranks of law enforcement. In the days following the incident, Charles Whitmore spiraled into collapse. The multi-million-dollar contracts he had once taken for granted were withdrawn one by one. Smaller real estate firms that once dreamed of partnering with him now sent polite apology, canceling negotiation, while some major partners didn't even respond, simply severing contact. The stock market reflected this downfall faster than any headline, with Whitmore Group shares plunging uncontrollably, triggering angry backlash from shareholders. They saw him as the direct cause of millions evaporating in just a few days. Every financial news segment mentioned his name alongside blazing red charts, a vivid symbol of the cost of arrogance. It wasn't just money Charles lost, but something he once believed untouchable. His family, his wife, who had long endured his domineering ways, now refused to appear publicly with him. She chose silence, retreating from the spotlight and the shame her husband had brought. Evenings in their vast mansion turned hollow, meals fell quiet. The only sounds, the cold clinks of silverware on porcelain. Even the house staff averted their eyes, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to be associated with a name drowning in disgrace. The greatest pain didn't come from headlines or shredded contracts, but from his son's gaze. David, the young man who had once idolized him as the model of success, now faced him with empty eyes. During one rare dinner, David set down his fork, looked directly at him, and said coldly, "I used to think you were strong, but now all I see is someone humiliating himself." The words hit Charles like a blade, leaving him breathless. He had built his empire to one day pass it down to his son, but now that son no longer wanted to follow in his footsteps. He only wanted to escape the shadow stained by disgrace. Charles stepped into his study, surrounded by expensive paintings and shelves of imported liquor, yet it all only deepened the emptiness inside him. He recalled the night of the party, the look in Naomi Carter's eyes as she spoke the words now echoed by millions, and the wave of applause that buried his authority. He realized that everything he thought was power was no more than a sandcastle, and now the tide had come. In the depths of isolation, he finally understood the true cost of arrogance, a price measured not in money, but in the loss of trust from those closest to him. The mansion that was once a symbol of pride had become nothing more than a cold, silent cage. Its vast rooms now felt empty, and the echo of his own footsteps served as a haunting reminder of an empire shaken to its core. Charles sat down in the armchair, holding his head in his hand. He felt, for the first time in years, completely powerless. All that remained was a heavy silence, and one unrelenting question. How had a joke he once thought harmless become a sentence that cost him both his career and his family? Naomi Carter didn't chase the spotlight after the explosive evening. She returned to her usual work in the familiar building, still wore rubber gloves, and still pushed the cleaning cart down the long hallways. But the air around her had changed. The glances that were once indifferent or dismissive now carried respect. Office workers nodded when passing her, some smiled kindly, and others stopped to say thank you. In a short time, Naomi had become a familiar face spoken of with reverence, not a quiet shadow, but a living symbol of working-class pride. Each morning, as Naomi scrubbed the stains from the marble floor, a few younger co-workers would stop by, eager to ask questions, hoping to hear more about the moment the world was now sharing. Naomi never said much. She simply explained that everything came from a basic belief, that no matter how small the job, it deserved recognition, and that respect was a right owed to everyone. But it was that very simplicity that deepened people's admiration. They didn't see her as a sudden star destined to fade, but as someone grounded, unshaken by the tides of public attention. The newspapers that once put Naomi on the front page now continued to follow her, though the stories had shifted. Instead of sensational headlines, they began writing about the daily life of a working woman, about the difference between a humble job and profound social impact. The media called her the woman in the red dress, while people around the Bronx saw her as a source of pride for the entire community. Many came to find her, hoping to shake her hand, take a photo, or just meet her in person. Some mothers even brought their children, pointed to Naomi, and gently said, "Remember, she's the example of how to hold your head high." As Naomi walked through the hallways that had once witnessed countless condescending glances, she now received a different kind of look, one of respect. The doorman smiled in greeting, the security guard opened the door gently, and former colleagues who once sneered now struck up conversations. This shift alone showed that society had reached a point where it needed to reassess how it treated jobs often taken for granted. One sentence she spoke during the party, one moment standing tall, had awakened millions, making them realize that dignity cannot be measured by occupation. Public opinion gave Naomi a new nickname, the symbol of self-respect. The title appeared everywhere, from panel discussions and academic essays to protest banners demanding labor rights. Naomi didn't reject it, but neither did she chase after it. She patiently continued wiping away dust, as if the humble work itself was the very foundation that kept her grounded. And in the eyes of those who had witnessed what happened at Whitmore Tower, Naomi Carter had moved beyond the role of a cleaner. She had become a living testament to the belief that a person can turn humiliation into strength, can rise from the lowest place to remind society of the true worth of dignity. The media storm turned Naomi Carter into a focal point, and with that sudden fame, many began to dig deeper into the person behind the red dress. Journalists, instead of merely recounting the moment she confronted Charles Whitmore, started tracing her past, piecing together the life of a woman who once seemed ordinary. From old university records and former classmates, people discovered that Naomi had been an outstanding music student at a prestigious school. Her name had appeared on the list of full scholarship recipients. Her voice once echoed through student concerts, and at one point, Naomi was considered a rising star with potential for major stages. A video clip from one of her old performances resurfaced, her voice youthful and full of passion, leaving many stunned, finding it hard to believe that the woman cleaning floors today once had such a brilliant beginning. But light is always accompanied by shadow. Naomi had once followed the path of music with full faith, but life pulled her away. In her final year of college, tragedy struck when her father died in a work accident, leaving behind a sick mother and a younger sibling not yet grown. The burden of medical bills piled up, and even with a generous scholarship, she couldn't support her family and pursue her dream at the same time. Naomi had to choose, and she chose to carry the weight herself. She dropped out, shelved her voice and dreams of the stage, and stepped into life with her first job as a cleaner in an old office building. From then on, her path shifted from the bright stage lights to the cold fluorescent glow of long hallways. Old friends were stunned by the news. Some expressed regret, calling it a great loss for music. Others stayed silent, understanding that Naomi had chosen responsibility over fame. To her, that decision wasn't a blind sacrifice, but the only way to keep her family from collapsing. During those years, Naomi worked full-time while caring for her mother and sibling, and it was that hardship forged the unshakable will that many later recognized when she stood at the podium in Whitmore Tower. The revelation of her past only deepened public admiration. People no longer saw Naomi as a phenomenon, but as a real person with dreams, losses, and an extraordinary strength to endure hardship. News outlets that once chased sensationalism shifted their tone, publishing moving articles about the former music student who gave up a bright future to protect her family. Commentators called Naomi the lost note of her generation, yet affirmed that she had found a different kind of stage, one not filled with orchestras and spotlights, but where her voice could carry far and touch millions of hearts. Naomi received the attention with her usual calm. When reporters asked if she ever regretted giving up music, she simply smiled and said that every decision leaves its own mark, and that without those difficult years, she wouldn't have had the strength to stand tall today. That simple statement only made her image shine brighter because it carried an undeniable truth. What Naomi now represents didn't come from luck or sudden opportunity, but from a past quietly filled with hardship and resolve. It is that truth that has made her an irreplaceable symbol of dignity and human strength in a society full of barriers. The red dress Naomi Carter wore that night wasn't a random choice meant to attract attention. It was a keepsake tied to her entire childhood. The dress once belonged to her mother, a modest woman who carried within her a deep longing to shine on stage. Years ago, Naomi's mother dreamed of becoming a singer and had worn that very dress during a small performance at a local theater, where even the dim lights made her glow. But illness and the burden of daily survival forced her to give it up, folding the dress and storing it in a wooden box like an unfinished memory. When Naomi put it on, she wasn't just wearing a garment, she was carrying her mother's unfulfilled dream, now reborn through her daughter. Within each worn thread, Naomi could feel the warmth of the woman she had lost, along with the faith and hope left behind. The red dress became a bridge between past and present, so that every step she took was not only her own against humiliation, but also a step for her mother and for every woman who had ever been forced to bury her dreams because of life's circumstances. That image moved the public even more, as they realized Naomi's story wasn't just a fleeting sensation, but the continuation of a spiritual legacy, a quiet strength passed down through generations. The truth about the red dress quickly spread after the media picked it up. A few local papers found people who had once known Naomi's mother, and they shared that she had a powerful voice, one that brought audiences to tears during small performances. When they learned that her daughter had worn that same dress to face an entire class of power, many couldn't hold back their emotion. They called it the moment a dream was reborn, a testament that even when a dream is left unfinished and forgotten, it can still come alive again in a different form, stronger, braver. Naomi didn't hide the meaning behind the dress. In an interview, she gently said, "This isn't my dress, it's my mother's. When I wear it, I feel like I'm not alone." That line cut deep into the hearts of those watching, because everyone holds memories tied to family, to the sacrifices of the generation before them. From that moment, the public no longer looked at Naomi with just admiration, but with profound empathy, as if she represented their own losses and hopes. The depth of her character became clear. Naomi was not just a woman who happened to step into a ballroom and spark a media storm. She was the product of a past full of tears, of family duty, and of a yearning to carry on a spiritual legacy. This turned her story from a fleeting media moment into a lasting symbol that stirred deep emotion. Readers, viewers, people watching from afar suddenly saw themselves in her story, saw the dreams they had abandoned, the burdens that once held them down, and from that, grew to cherish even more the resilience Naomi embodied. The red dress, because of that, crossed the line from clothing to cultural icon, referenced in discussions about justice, equality, and human dignity. The image of Naomi in that dress appeared not only in the press but also on posters, in hand-painted murals by street artists, and even in classrooms where teachers used her story to inspire students. And so, the private story of a family, of a mother and daughter, moved beyond the personal to touch millions of hearts, making Naomi Carter a symbol of dignity, not just in a single moment, but in the long memory of society. After days of social media uproar and constant news coverage, public pressure forced the city council to open a special hearing on discrimination. The main chamber of the city hall was packed, not only with officials and delegates, but with people from all walks of life. News outlets broadcast the event live. Millions tuned in, all waiting to hear from the witnesses, especially the woman who had become a symbol, Naomi Carter. When her name was called, the hall erupted in applause. Not loud or chaotic, but steady, like a shared moment of agreement, as if everyone hoped to hear truth laid bare. Naomi stepped up to the podium with calm composure. A plain white blouse and black skirt blended her into the solemn setting, but her bright, focused gaze held everyone's attention. She placed her hand on the microphone, took a deep breath, and spoke, her voice low but full of weight. "I'm not here to tell a personal story. I'm here to remind you that what happened to me isn't unique. There are thousands who work in the shadows, treated with disregard, robbed of opportunity, just because they don't fit the mold this society worships." The hall fell completely silent. Every word Naomi said landed like an arrow straight into the hearts of the listeners. She spoke of years spent cleaning the building's lobby, where cold stares greeted her daily, where she felt invisible, as if her presence didn't matter. She recalled the night of the party, how she was made a joke in front of hundreds, then insulted by the police because of her skin and her job. "I understand what millions feel when they're pushed aside as if they don't matter, because I've lived that feeling for nearly half my life." Some in the room lowered their heads, a few delegates sighed, and many audience members had tears in their eyes. Naomi went on, her voice stronger now, fueled by that shared emotion. "What I want to say is, Justice isn't something buried in long reports or empty promises. Justice must be seen, must be felt, must live in how we treat each other every day. And if those in power still believe they can look down on others without consequence, the truth from that night proved them wrong. A heavy silence blanketed the entire hall after that sentence. There were no more sounds of typing or whispers. Only Naomi's voice rang out clearly. Her words weren't ornate, didn't need complicated language, but carried the full weight of truth, the strength of lived experience that anyone could understand. When she ended her speech with the words, "I don't want the next generation to endure the humiliation I once did," the entire hall erupted in applause. No one remained seated. Many people jumped to their feet, eyes glowing with emotion. In that moment, Naomi Carter was no longer just a witness. She became the collective voice of thousands who had been forgotten, a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still come knocking if there's enough courage to call for it. And in that very second, the city began to realize it could no longer turn its back on the truth. After days of silence, Charles Whitmore tried to build a wall around himself. He hired a team of top-tier lawyers, spent large sums on media consultants, hoping to stop the wave of criticism. A few sympathetic articles appeared in smaller outlets, stressing that the incident at Whitmore Tower was a misunderstanding, that Naomi Carter had used the moment to create a sensation. But those excuses failed to convince, because the public held the footage, the words of Charles E.S. and both officers on record that night. Every attempt to cover up the truth was like flimsy wood against a crashing wave. The more patched up, the more easily shattered. At the hearings, he showed up trying to look composed, but his anxious eyes betrayed him, and each evasive answer only fueled more outrage. Online, commenters mocked him as the man who wrote the script but forgot he was being filmed. While Charles failed to salvage his reputation, officers Blake and Rowan couldn't escape the storm of investigations either. The video clips were replayed repeatedly, showing them using discriminatory language right in the ballroom, in front of hundreds. The Internal Affairs Board had no choice but to intervene, and this time, under immense public pressure, nothing could be swept aside. Their old records were reopened, revealing numerous prior complaints that had been shelved. Witnesses came forward one by one, recounting instances of being stopped, insulted, and mistreated by the two officers. The wave of accusations was like an avalanche, leaving them with nowhere to hide. The day the official announcement was made, the press crowded in front of the police headquarters. Countless cameras pointed at the two faces that once brazenly wielded authority. Both Blake and Rowan were suspended and faced criminal investigation. Images of them with heads bowed, silently walking through a sea of flashing cameras, became the centerpiece of every news outlet. The public celebrated, viewing this as the first victory for justice after a long string of disappointments. Social activists held marches, raising the image of the red dress as a symbol of truth that could no longer be buried. At the next hearing, when the investigative report was presented, the hall stood in extended applause. Justice was no longer just a slogan, but now appeared in concrete decisions. People believed the truth had forced the abusers of power to bow their heads, and that this was a signal for society to reevaluate how it treats the vulnerable. Naomi sat quietly in the back row, watching, her eyes reflecting relief. She didn't need pride for herself, because this victory belonged to everyone who had ever been disregarded. Charles, meanwhile, became more isolated. The press no longer cared about him as before, his name gradually becoming a symbol of a fallen, arrogant empire. Despite efforts to conceal it, everything he did only made his weakness and selfishness more visible. His image, along with the downfall of Blake and Rowan, stood as proof that power, when used to oppress, would collapse in the face of justice. And in that moment, the entire city understood that justice wasn't some distant concept. It became visible when truth came to light, when the powerful had to bow before human dignity. Charles Whitmore sat in silence inside the vast mansion that once symbolized his wealth and power. The warm light cast across walls lined with priceless art only deepened the coldness, like a museum filled with memories but void of life. Everything around him was too perfect, too expensive, yet nothing could ease the emptiness in his mind. The downfall had come as swiftly as a storm, stripping him of everything he once held: lucrative deals, social respect, even the trust of his family. The phone on his desk sat silent, no longer ringing with calls from partners, only a heavy quiet pressing down on him. The loss of power felt like being dragged from a throne, only to realize that behind the spotlight, he was just a lonely man left behind. In the all-consuming stillness, memories crept back, not the triumphant ones, but a chain of bitter images from times he had belittled others. He remembered a lavish party where a server dropped a glass of wine in front of a guest, and how he had shouted so harshly that the entire room fell silent. Back then, he believed that was how power was asserted, how fear commanded respect. But now, recalling the fear in that server's eyes. Charles felt his heart tighten, as if he had just slapped himself. Then came the image of a cleaning woman kneeling and pleading for a few days off to care for her sick mother. He had dismissed her coldly, saying, "Rest isn't in your contract. If you can't work, someone else will." That line had once been his measure of toughness. Now it echoed like a knife, twisting through his conscience. The memories didn't stop there. Charles remembered the major deals where he'd used scorn to pressure his counterparts. The disappointed eyes of a young entrepreneur still haunted him. Someone who once saw Charles as a role model, but walked away hollow-eyed after realizing the cruelty behind the glamour. The sound of his own mocking laughter when an employee was fired for speaking up against injustice rang in his ears again. But this time it brought no satisfaction. It was like staring into a mirror that reflected a distorted man. Someone who had convinced himself that power meant trampling others' dignity without consequence. Outside the window, the wind howled, branches scraping against the glass in a rapid tapping rhythm. Charles flinched, realizing it was the first time in years he had feared something so trivial. But the fear wasn't of the dark. It was the fear of facing himself, of confronting the truth that his throne had been built on humiliation and contempt. And when that wall crumbled, he saw clearly that he was left with nothing but loneliness and a soul riddled with fractures. The external losses were only part of it. The real pain came from witnessing the collapse of his own character. He stepped toward the large mirror in the hallway and stared at the reflection of an old man, hair disheveled, eyes weary. This wasn't the man who once strode into any room with confidence, who raised a glass of wine with disdain, who made others tremble under his power. The face staring back held only erosion, the shadow of a man defeated. Charles touched the surface of the mirror, a chill shooting down his spine. He realized that the collapse hadn't come from others' judgment, but from the arrogance that had been etched deep into his character for years. In the darkness of the mansion, Charles sank back into the armchair, his shoulders heavy. He could no longer find a reason to defend himself, as images from the past returned in relentless waves. They came together into one cruel truth: a life lived with his head held high through contempt, now paid for with an unbearable emptiness. His inner self had fractured, and each shard cut into his heart, making him understand that the greatest loss wasn't wealth or power, but the inability to face the mirror without shame. And in that long night, Charles Whitmore understood that his life had turned to a new chapter, a chapter steeped in darkness, where loneliness would be his only companion. David Whitmore stood at the threshold of the study, hallway light casting just enough glow to reveal the gaunt face of his father. The room that once defined Charles's authority was now nothing but a dim, suffocating space, its priceless paintings staring down like cold judges. David leaned quietly against the doorframe, eyes fixed on the father who had once been a source of pride, once a model to emulate, now reduced to a slumped figure. Head bowed, hair disheveled, hands covering his face, as if he could no longer bear the weight. The contrast struck David in the chest, like a blow. He had stayed silent too long, watching, and finally spoke, a voice low, hoarse, but clear in the stillness. "What have you become, father?" The sound sliced through the heavy air like a freezing blade. Charles flinched, his shoulders twitching, and he slowly looked up, eyes clouded and disoriented. The question held no anger, but something far heavier: disappointment, coming from his own son. In that moment, Charles saw clearly that David's gaze no longer held admiration, no longer sparkled with belief, but instead reflected sorrow, and even a trace of pity. That pain struck deeper than any public condemnation, because it came from someone who once saw him as a symbol of success. Charles parted his lips to speak, but his throat locked tight, as if every word he had once used to impose authority had turned to weight he could no longer lift. "What have you become, father?" The question echoed in his mind, bouncing from wall to wall, stretching out like a death knell for his pride. Charles tried to force a weak smile, but it vanished quickly, as even he could feel the falseness in it. He stammered, I thought I was protecting dignity." The feeble excuse slipped from his lips, making David frown, his eyes harder now, his gaze colder. He cut in immediately. "What dignity is there when you turn others into a joke? What power is left when it's bought with humiliation?" Those words fell like arrows, piercing straight through the cracks in Charles's conscience. His fists clenched, not in anger, but in pain, swelling like waves. In his mind, images flashed back, fragments of memory piecing together a dark portrait of his life. He saw the faces of those he had belittled, heard again his own mocking laughter at parties, saw the fear in employees' eyes when he shouted, and heard the hollow applause he once mistook for admiration. It all blurred together, urgent and suffocating, drowning him in a guilt he had never known. Charles bowed his head, his breath growing heavy. He wanted to find a convincing explanation, a defense for himself, but every excuse vanished when faced with the obvious truth. His entire life had measured strength through contempt. What David had said was like a mirror, exposing a distorted man he had tried to hide. He saw himself stripped bare, with nothing left to hold on to, and that very realization tightened his chest, as if an invisible hand was choking the air from him. David said nothing more. He simply stood there, his eyes delivering a silent verdict. The silence from his son was more terrifying than any accusation, because it lingered, cold and suffocating, pressing down on Charles. He looked up, hoping to find even a trace of warmth, but saw only distance in that gaze. It wasn't just the distance of a generation, it was the distance between a man blinded by greed and one demanding truth. As David turned and walked away, the echo of his footsteps in the vast house made Charles feel smaller than ever. The sound of the door closing landed with a hollow thud, like the final punctuation mark to every illusion he had clung to. He sat frozen, both hands cradling his head, letting the echo of that question repeat over and over. "What have you become, Father?" Each time it rang out, it felt like a shard of glass cutting into his heart, deepening the fracture a little more. In the dim light that remained, Charles, for the first time in decades, admitted to himself that power, wealth, and reputation meant nothing if trust from family had crumbled. He realized that the harshest punishment didn't come from the media, shareholders, or business partner, but from the disappointed gaze of his own blood. The break in his conscience couldn't be mended with money, couldn't be masked by authority, and would follow him for the rest of his life like a scar that would never heal. And in that moment, Charles Whitmore understood that the heaviest sentence he had to bear wasn't out there. It was buried deep within his own heart. In the days following the conversation with his son, Charles Whitmore lived in a state of confusion, as if the entire world he once knew had just collapsed. The vast mansion grew hauntingly silent, each window, each armchair, each long hallway no longer symbols of power, but more like a cage holding a fallen man. In sleepless nights, he wandered aimlessly through darkened rooms, his mind trapped in a question with no answer. Should he cling to the shell of pride to survive the public backlash, or should he lower himself, issue a public apology, and finally face the truth he had long avoided? Never in his life had he faced a decision so difficult, for in his core, bowing to the public had always equated to absolute failure. But the growing emptiness inside him made him unsure of what true strength really meant anymore. Outside, the storm of public outrage never ceased. The media kept digging up his derogatory remarks, his arrogant actions at lavish events, and the evidence exposing how he used power to trample others. Each article felt like another knife turning in the already crumbling reputation he had once built. Charles watched the news screen and saw himself being tried in public, without courtrooms or juries, judged instead by an entire society. He realized that if he continued denying everything, he would only sink deeper into the pit of contempt, and by then, he would have no chance left to salvage any dignity. That realization weighed on him like stone, forcing him to face the truth. Either he changed, or he would be buried completely. In his desperation, he turned to his personal lawyer, the man who had stood by him for years and pulled him through countless legal battles. The meeting took place in a small office, without wine or celebratory toasts, just two men sitting across from each other in heavy silence. Charles recounted the pressure, the fury, the humiliation he was enduring, hoping to find a way out like he always had. But this time, the answer was unlike anything he had heard before. The aging lawyer looked him directly in the eye, voice calm but firm. "Only the truth can save you." The short sentence echoed like a verdict. Charles fell silent, waiting for strategies, legal maneuvers, the usual tricks. But instead he received a piece of advice so simple it felt brutal. The lawyer explained that the public had seen and remembered everything. No excuse, no PR campaign would work. The only thing that could keep him from total ruin was to admit his mistakes and apologize. Charles sat frozen, eyes reddening, because he knew the old friend across from him was no longer speaking as a man paid to defend him, but as someone speaking a raw and undeniable truth. That night, returning to the silent mansion, Charles walked down the long hallway, each step heavy. He stopped in front of a mirror, seeing the wrinkled face, the tired eyes, a stranger he never imagined he would become. In the solitude, he muttered the words he had just heard. "Only the truth can save you." They echoed in his mind, blending with his son's question, "What have you become?" forming a string of sounds that cut deep into his thoughts. He realized that for years, he had built his power on fear and flattery, not on real respect. And now, with those layers stripped away, all that remained was an empty, fragile shell. Charles entered his study, where the desk lamp lit up thick stacks of documents, the contracts that once brought brought him wealth. He flipped through the pages, but instead of a sense of triumph, he felt nothing but hollow lines. Money, real estate, reputation, once everything to him, now felt like burdens. Cold numbers piling on his shoulders. A new question rose inside him. Was it worth holding on to all of this? If the price was being destroyed in his son's eyes, in the eyes of those who once believed in him, and above all, in his own conscience. Outside the window, rain began to fall, each drop heavy as it tapped against the glass. Charles stared out, imagining the moment he would have to stand before the public, admit his wrongs, say the words, "I'm sorry," something he had never once considered in his life. The thought made him shiver, yet it planted a faint light within him. Perhaps it was the only path out of the darkness, the only way to find even a shred of peace in his fractured soul. He knew now, this was no longer a question of choice, but a matter of destiny, and he would have to face it. Naomi Carter, after days of constant appearances on the front pages, began to feel the weight of pressure. Though she had no regrets about what she had done, the excessive media attention, the pursuit by organizations, and the flood of invitations from all sides unsettled her. Several companies offered to turn her image into the face of promotional campaigns, while other groups sought to attach her name to slogans for visibility. Naomi understood that accepting would quickly turn her into a commercial icon, but it would also twist the message she had fought so hard to protect into a tool for interests that were not her own. Inside her, that fear rose like a heavy cloud, because she knew well that what had touched people's hearts was not glamour, but sincerity and dignity. She turned down many invitations, choosing silence as various campaigns tried to borrow her name for promotion. In rare interviews, Naomi stated firmly, "I don't want to become a symbol on a poster for people to admire. I want workers to see that their worth is genuinely respected." That honest declaration earned her even more public trust, but also unintentionally placed her in opposition to those seeking to exploit her name. In the midst of an increasingly fierce media storm, Naomi longed for something simpler, to preserve the original spirit of her action without letting it be distorted. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore, after days of collapse, decided to send a message requesting a face-to-face meeting. The offer initially unsettled Naomi, as he was the one who had unleashed the storm, and she did not want to be part of any performance aimed at salvaging his image. But after many restless nights, she understood that this confrontation could not be avoided. Avoiding it would only let the ghost of the past linger, while facing it might close the cycle of resentment. She agreed, with one condition: the meeting must take place in a modest setting, with no cameras, no flashlights, no reporters, so that the truth could appear in full. On the agreed day, Charles arrived early, his aged face deeply lined with weariness. No more luxury tuxedo or proud smile. He sat alone in a small room at the community center, dim light casting shadows across his worn face. When the door opened, Naomi walked in, calm, her eyes bright but free of hatred. In that moment, two people from once opposing worlds sat at the same old wooden table, with no barriers left but the raw truth. Charles hesitated before speaking, his voice hoarse. "I want to apologize, but I know it's not enough." Naomi remained silent, her eyes steady, as if waiting to see what he truly intended. He went on, "I'm not here to save face. I'm here because I need to face myself. I was wrong, and I want to start again, not with words, but with action." Naomi nodded slightly, then replied calmly, "I don't want to be used by anyone. If you mean it, remember that only action proves sincerity. Words are just wind." The room fell silent, but within that silence, both understood they were standing at a turning point. They had not come to heal a relationship, but to search for a path forward, where the past was acknowledged and change had a chance to begin. In that moment, Naomi was no longer a victim, Charles no longer a figure of dominance. They were simply two human beings, face to face with themselves and with the weight of their own choices. One late afternoon, under a gray sky and strong winds sweeping through narrow streets, Charles Whitmore stepped out of his luxury car and stopped in front of an old residential area on the outskirts of the city. It was the first time in his life he had set foot in such a place, a working-class neighborhood he had only ever heard of through real estate reports. Places he once considered numbers on paper, not homes to thousands of lives. The faded red brick building, the moss-streaked walls, the rusted iron staircases, and the sound of children playing on cracked concrete painted a scene entirely foreign to the luxury that had always surrounded him. Charles pulled his collar tighter, walked slowly, his eyes meeting the wary stares of a few neighbors sitting by their doors. Unsure why a man so well dressed, stepping out of such an expensive car, had come to a place never meant to appear on the maps of the elite. The narrow path led him to the building where Naomi Carter lived. Charles looked up at the old windows with torn curtains and a faded sign barely hanging above the entrance. He couldn't help but think of the carpeted hallways in his own mansion, where crystal chandeliers reflected off antique paintings, where the scent of polished wood filled the air with luxury. Now, Before him stood a different reality, a stark contrast so sharp it unsettled him. For a moment, he saw clearly that his world had been built on a distance too wide from people like Naomi, and that distance revealed itself in every step of the aging staircase he was about to climb. The staircase to Naomi's apartment was narrow and rusted, each step creaking under his weight. Charles gripped the railing tightly, feeling the cold metal seep into his hand. He suddenly thought of the winding staircase in his mansion, where light shimmered down from chandeliers onto plush red carpet, where every step he took had once been seen as a symbol of triumph. The contrast between the two places cut through him like a blade, forcing him to question what he had ever truly known about the world beyond the circle of wealth and power. Standing before the chipped wooden door, Charles took a deep breath. Inside was a world Naomi and her young daughter called home, a world he had never cared to understand. The noise from the street market below, the smell of food wafting up from nearby apartments, the laughter, the arguments echoing through paper-thin walls, all of it blended into a vivid living scene, utterly unlike the vast, silent emptiness of his mansion. And yet, that very closeness, that crowding breathed warmth, a warmth he had long lost in the spacious rooms of his cold luxury. The door opened and Naomi appeared in a simple outfit, wearing an old sweater, her hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her apartment was small but clean, with white painted walls now slightly faded, an old wooden table in the center, a few books neatly arranged on a shelf, and a pair of children's shoes placed carefully near the door. As Charles stepped in, he paused instinctively, because the simplicity reminded him of what he had lost in his own family. In that brief moment, he realized this was a place full of life, of connection, while his luxurious mansion had become nothing more than a soulless shell. Sitting down on a creaky wooden chair, Charles glanced around the cramped but warm room. The signs of time didn't make it look worn out, but rather gave it a kind of quiet strength. He felt small in that space, as if the entire outer shell of power had been stripped away, leaving only a bare, weary man. The contrast between his mansion and Naomi's apartment wasn't just physical, it symbolized the clash between two worlds, one of proud wealth, the other of labor and dignity. And in this narrow place, Charles understood that the meeting ahead was no longer a negotiation, but a direct confrontation with the truth he had avoided for too long. Inside the small apartment, the yellow light from a single bulb cast a muted glow over the old wooden table. Charles Whitmore sat across from Naomi Carter, his hands tightly clasped, his eyes lost like someone adrift in his own life. He hesitated for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I came here to say I'm sorry." The words came out heavy, as if even he wasn't used to saying them. Naomi didn't reply right away. She watched him, her gaze calm but unwavering, and Charles felt exposed under it. He took a deep breath, searching for more courage. "I know these words can't undo what I've done, but I can't keep running. I need to admit the truth, that I was wrong." Naomi tilted her head, her voice steady. "Do you think an apology makes it all disappear? What you did wasn't just a joke, it became a wound for many people." Charles lowered his head, his hands shaking, and answered quietly, "I know, and I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I just want to start from here, even if it's late." His words fell into the small space, heavy and harsh. Naomi sighed, her eyes no longer cold, but tired. "Forgiveness isn't a gift you take for yourself. It only means something when you truly change." Charles looked up, his eyes filled with both despair and determination. "Give me a chance, I'll do anything to prove it." Naomi looked at him, her gaze not angry but firm. "I don't need you to prove it to me. I need you to prove it to yourself and to this society. You've had more than enough, and you used it to humiliate others. If you still have any conscience left, use what you have to make things right." The silence lingered, broken only by the wind howling outside the window. Charles buried his face in his hand, overwhelmed by a regret he had never known. What he had just heard wasn't rejection, nor was it forgiveness, but a condition, a threshold he had to cross if he wanted to be seen differently. When he looked up, Naomi continued, her voice firm. "You have money, but use it to make change, not to smear." That sentence echoed like a sentence and a way out all at once. Charles sat motionless, feeling each word pierce deeper into his mind. He understood that Naomi didn't need promises, and she didn't need hollow apologies. What she wanted was real change, proven by action, not some glossy campaign to save face. In that moment, he realized the door in front of him hadn't closed, but it would only open if he stepped through it with a different mindset, leaving behind arrogance and justification. Naomi stood up and poured more tea, the simple movement carrying unexpected strength. She set the cup down on the table, eyes steady. "I can't tell you what to do, but I know exactly what must never happen again. If you ever again turn someone into a tool for your joke or your spectacle, no apology will be enough to save you." Charles nodded, breathing hard, knowing he had just heard the final verdict. He couldn't ask for forgiveness. He could only earn it through what he did next. The small room suddenly felt like the place where fate was decided, without crystal chandeliers or hundreds of eyes, just two people facing each other. One had once stood at the top, now sitting at the lowest point in his life. The other once disregarded, now speaking a truth the whole society was listening to. And in that quiet moment, Charles understood Naomi had given him a chance. Not out of mercy, but out of a sense of justice he had never learned. This was the crossroads he had to face. Either fall deeper into the abyss, or use what power and wealth he still had to redeem what had been lost. After weeks of silence, while public outrage continued and headlines repeatedly cited his name as a symbol of arrogance, Charles Whitmore unexpectedly appeared at a live televised press conference. The room was packed with reporters, hundreds of cameras pointed at the podium, flashes firing in rapid succession. Gone was the confident figure. Gone was the lavish tuxedo that once made him the center of attention. Charles stepped forward in a simple suit, his hair streaked with gray, his face hollowed as if stripped of its familiar gloss. He stood still for a few seconds in front of the microphone, letting the noise settle, then spoke in a hoarse but steady voice. "I'm here not to defend myself, but to admit my mistakes." The room fell silent, no one expecting the man who once saw himself as untouchable to open with such humility. Charles continued, "I was wrong to turn a human being into a joke, to believe that status and wealth gave me the right to trample on someone else's dignity. I apologize to Naomi Carter, and I apologize to all those who have lived in silence after being disregarded. This apology may come late, but I need to say it in front of the entire city." His voice trembled slightly, but his gaze remained steady, as if he knew that only by confronting the truth could he find a way forward. After the apology, whispers rippled through the hall, reporters scribbling quickly, some cameras zooming in to catch every expression. Some were skeptical, others listened intently, waiting for more than just words. Charles paused, then announced his next step. "I will establish the Red Dress Fund, a foundation dedicated to supporting working women, protecting them from discrimination and humiliation. The initial funding will be $10 million, and I pledge to commit most of my remaining assets to this cause." The statement sent a jolt through the room. Many looked up, exchanging glances, and a few reporters rushed to ask questions. Charles raised his hand to continue. "I don't want this fund to exist in name only. I want it to be a place where every working woman can find protection, where their voices are heard. I once used power to instill fear. Now, I want to use what remains to help repair some of the harm I've contributed to." His words carried weight, not because of eloquence, but because they came from a man who had once stood at the top and was now bowing before the public. Journalists pressed him on the fund's transparency, questioning whether this was just a ploy to salvage his reputation. Charles didn't deflect. He answered directly, "I understand the doubt, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. Time and action will be the answer." Outside the auditorium, thousands watched live from large screens. Many viewers were moved by his admission of guilt, but there were also murmurs of skepticism. On social media, images of Charles bowing his head in apology and announcing the fund spread rapidly. Comments quickly divided into two camps. Some saw it as a turning point worthy of recognition, while others emphasized that redemption must be proven over time, not just declared in words. When asked for her reaction, Naomi Carter simply smiled calmly. She said that an apology does not change the past, but if it opens a new path where workers are protected and respected, then that is what she hopes to see. Her words drew even more public attention, as they reminded people that forgiveness does not come from fleeting emotion, from real change through action. When the press conference ended, Charles stepped down from the podium to scattered applause, mixed with wary stares. Though his image was far from restored, for the first time in years, he was no longer hiding behind arrogance, but publicly facing his own wrongdoing. And in that moment, he planted a seed of change, one that only time and action could determine whether it would grow into renewed public trust. The apology spoken by Charles Whitmore shook the entire city. People had long grown used to seeing him as arrogant, always surrounded by luxury and condescension, so when he stood before the crowd, bowed his head, and admitted fault publicly, the shock was undeniable. For years, Charles had treated pride as armor and used disdain as a measure of power, so the moment he shed that persona felt like an earthquake. International media immediately picked up the story, printing shocking headlines. "Real estate mogul apologizes to society. The man who once sneered now bows before the truth." The stark contrast between past and present transformed what was merely an apology into a moment of reckoning. That day in the auditorium, many sat in stunned silence. A few veteran reporters who had once seen Charles at elite parties now looked at him in disbelief. Some social activists in the front rows leaned forward, wide-eyed, seemingly unable to believe that the man who once looked down on them now had to admit his faults in public. The impact didn't come from the words themselves, but from the fact that they were spoken by someone who had never known how to bow. And in that astonishment, people began to wonder whether this was the beginning of real change, or just a carefully staged performance. Although skepticism remained, a wave of positive reactions began to take shape. On social media, images of Charles bowing his head were shared repeatedly, alongside thousands of comments. One user wrote, "If even Whitmore can admit he was wrong, maybe this society can change." Another commented, "Don't forgive too quickly, but at least he took the first step." Hashtags related to the event flooded timeline, and videos capturing the moment quickly climbed trending charts, drawing millions of views. While many still approached the situation with caution, they couldn't deny that his apology had sparked a glimmer of hope, that power wasn't an untouchable shield. The media quickly analyzed the event from multiple angles. Some commentators argued that it was the result of overwhelming public pressure forcing Charles to change, but others believed that behind his tired eyes was genuine remorse. A social scholar noted on live television, "The weight of an apology doesn't lie in its length, but in who says it." When someone once full of pride admits they were wrong, it's not just a personal change. It sends a message to society. These analyses led the public to begin seeing the situation through a more balanced lens, rather than focusing solely on doubt. Step by step, Charles's transformation began to gain recognition. A few former business partners who had publicly severed ties weren't yet ready to re-engage, but they did voice support for the founding of the Red Dress Fund. Some non-profit organizations that had initially been skeptical, after reviewing transparent financial commitments, gradually agreed to participate. This shift felt like a breeze easing the heavy air of resentment. People began to talk about the possibility that, for the first time, an arrogant man might truly be learning humility. To the public, change couldn't be measured by a few speeches, but Charles's continued presence at small community events helped reinforce trust. He sat quietly in the back row of a discussion on women in labor, listening without speaking. He signed asset transfer documents for the fund in front of oversight officials to affirm transparency. That image spread, and more people began to believe that he no longer sought to salvage his reputation, but genuinely wanted to make amends. As public opinion began to acknowledge the change, the story of Charles and Naomi became a focal point of discussion in many places. In schools, teachers used it as an example in lessons about arrogance and the value of an apology. On social forums, people shared the sentiment that justice might arrive late, but when it does, it has the power to bring even the most arrogant to their knees. The event didn't just alter how one man was seen, it planted hope in a fractured society that change is real, as long as someone is willing to face it. And in the moment when the city was still abuzz with talk, people began to realize that the powerful words spoken that day had extended far beyond a single press conference. It wasn't just a turning point in Charles Whitmore's life, but a reminder that honor is not built on power, but on the ability to admit mistakes and the courage to make things right. From that moment on, the public stopped seeing him as an untouchable figure of arrogance and began recognizing him as a man relearning how to be human. 1 year after the scandal at the gala, the name Naomi Carter was no longer tied to a single shocking event, but had become a living symbol of the power of self-respect. In the months following Charles's public apology and the founding of the Red Dress Fund, Naomi quietly continued her usual work, but the way people looked at her had changed. The hallways, once filled with scorn, now greeted her steps with nods of respect. It was that calm presence that led many to believe Naomi had never sought the spotlight, but somehow, the spotlight had found her. When the organizers of a national conference on social justice extended a formal invitation, public interest exploded. People weren't just eager to hear a speech, but to witness how an ordinary woman had turned humiliation into strength, forcing society to reevaluate its perspective. On the day of the conference, the auditorium was packed, thousands in attendance, with millions watching the live broadcast. When Naomi stepped onto the stage, wearing the red dress that had become a symbol, the entire hall rose to its feet in applause. The thunderous clapping continued for several minutes, filling the room with reverence, as if everyone collectively acknowledged they were in the presence of living courage. Naomi gave a slight bow, then stood tall, eyes shining, showing no trace of the woman who had once been dragged into ridicule before a crowd. In that moment, she stood like a queen, not of power or thrones, but of pride built from bravery. When Naomi began to speak, her voice was warm, steady, and clear, each word striking a chord with the audience. She didn't recount the details of the event that had once shocked the city, but chose instead to share the long journey of invisible workers. She spoke of the calloused hands that cleaned grand lobbies each night, of faces lowered from being disrespected, of the sorrow that came when human worth was tied to occupation. This red dress, she said, isn't just a keepsake from my mother, but a reminder that dignity is never measured by wages or titles. It belongs to all of us, those still fighting to be seen. The room listened in silence, then erupted into waves of applause. Some shed tears. Others rose to their feet, chanting her name. No one saw Naomi as just a cleaning woman anymore. They saw in her the presence of millions who had long been forgotten. Headlines that day read, "The Red Queen of Justice, Naomi Carter, and the Dress That Changed a Nation." Editorials emphasized that her speech didn't just stir emotion, it awakened a sense of responsibility in everyone. From that point on, the image of the red dress moved beyond the scope of a personal story and became a national symbol. Photos of Naomi in that moment of her speech were printed on the front pages of major newspapers, hung in schools, displayed on city walls, and even painted into street murals by local artists. The red dress became a visual message of self-respect, of the pride of those who refuse to let others trample their worth. Slogans tagged with number red dress spread across social media, no longer tied solely to Naomi, but becoming a shared symbol of a movement against discrimination and for the dignity of every person. Not only within the country, but the impact of the speech crossed borders. Many international outlets reported on it, comparing Naomi to global icons of justice and human rights. International conferences began sending her invitation, recognizing her as the voice of forgotten workers. Governments in several other countries, inspired by the Red Dress Fund, launched their own programs to support female laborers. That momentum turned Naomi's story into a global movement, with the red dress flying as a banner of unyielding pride. Returning from the conference, Naomi still walked the same familiar streets, still stopped by the small grocery on the corner, still smiled at her neighbors as if nothing had changed. But everyone who passed her paused, nodded with respect. Naomi never sought a throne, but the red dress had made her a queen in the hearts of society. And from that moment forward, it became clear that Naomi Carter's story would not fade into memory, but continue to inspire future generations, standing as eternal proof that an ordinary person can change the world. After the national conference, Naomi Carter did not return to the quiet life she once led. The light from her story spread far and wide, making her a figure followed by millions. However, what the public admired was not the glamour on stage, but the way Naomi maintained her humility in every step she took. Instead of basking in fame, she used her new voice to lead and uplift female workers who had long suffered in silence. A series of gatherings was held in schools, factories, and neighborhoods, where Naomi appeared with warmth and simplicity, encouraging other women to stand up for their rights. She listened to their story, from single mothers shamed at work to cleaners paid unfair wages, then patiently offered practical solutions. Her sincerity turned each meeting into a source of strength, planting faith in the hearts of those who had long been told their worth didn't matter. Naomi gradually became a guiding figure, not through grand speeches, but through her real presence in community life. Many women, after hearing her speak, found the courage to file complaints about the injustices they had endured, while others began joining labor advocacy groups. Naomi did not stand above to give commands, but walked beside them, taking each small step together. She often said, "I don't want to be the only one telling this story. I want everyone here to have a story to tell." That statement became a driving force, turning a small spark into a powerful wave that reshaped society's perception of professions often looked down upon. The media continuously reported on her, portraying Naomi as a living torch for working women. But what gave her image lasting power wasn't the praise from the press. It was the consistent actions she took. Projects funded by the Red Dress Fund were launched, providing scholarships for workers' children, opening skill training courses to help them advance, and offering legal support to those facing workplace injustice. Wherever those programs appeared, people spoke of Naomi as a symbol of change. Many women who received help broke into tears, saying their story gave them the strength to move past their fear. More and more, the name Naomi Carter became synonymous with dignity and justice. Major newspapers wrote that she didn't just represent one person who had been humiliated, but everyone who had ever been looked down upon in society. In classrooms, teachers used Naomi's story to illustrate lessons on human worth. On international platforms, whenever discussions on anti-discrimination and women's rights arose, Naomi was cited as a living example of the power of courage. People began to understand that justice doesn't come only from courts or legal systems, but also from the steady actions of ordinary people brave enough to stand up. Naomi constantly emphasized that she never wanted to become a legend. She only wanted to be remembered as a cleaning woman who refused to let anyone strip away her dignity. It was that humility that made her image shine even more. Whitmore. From the narrow streets of working-class neighborhoods to elegant conference halls, people spoke the name Naomi Carter with respect. To working women, she was proof that their voices mattered. To the younger generation, she was a reminder that self-respect mattered more than any title. And to society, Naomi Carter was evidence that a person who once seemed small could change how an entire era viewed worth. That name, once mentioned, no longer recalled the humiliation of a lavish party, but became tied to the power of dignity and justice. Naomi Carter had stepped out from the shadow of contempt to become a symbol of standing tall, so that whenever someone faced injustice, they would remember that it was still possible to rise and reclaim their value. And from this moment on, the image of the woman in the red dress would live on in collective memory, as an enduring symbol of pride and courage. A year had passed since the lavish party that was meant to turn a woman into a joke, and society had changed more than anyone could have imagined. What began as an act of humiliation was now seen as a turning point, marking a shift in public awareness. The media still recalled that night as a historical moment, when arrogance was exposed and dignity was restored. Old articles and video clips of Naomi walking into the ballroom in her red dress continued to circulate, not as a scandal, but as a reminder of justice's power. That party, once entertainment for the elite, had become a societal lesson, studied in classrooms, discussed at conferences, and even referenced in international human rights forums. Naomi Carter, who once entered that room with her head held high, had since become a familiar face in community work. After the Red Dress Fund was established, Naomi agreed to lead its key projects. Alongside her colleagues, she visited labor neighborhoods, met with women in factories, hospitals, and schools, listened to their concern, and offered practical support. It wasn't just emergency aid. The fund created skill training programs and legal services to help working women protect their rights. In just 1 year, hundreds of women had received help, dozens of families found stability, and many who had once suffered in silence were now stepping forward to speak up. Naomi didn't seek to stand above others and command. She chose to walk beside them. She frequently visited small textile workshops, sat with workers after their shifts, and spoke with them as a friend, not a leader. That image spread, strengthening the movement against discrimination. Women who once believed silence was the only way to survive had begun learning how to raise their voices. Many said Naomi gave them that confidence because she had stood in their place, and her willingness to face a prejudiced society proved that anyone could do the same. At the same time, the impact of the event reached a broader level. Companies began reviewing their policies toward female workers, and several agencies issued clearer regulations against discrimination in the workplace. Statistics showed an increase in the number of formal complaints being received, proving that women were starting to believe their voices would be heard. City officials began allocating more funding for labor rights programs, acknowledging the influence of the movement Naomi and her allies had started. The image of the red dress, once a symbol of humiliation, had now become a national emblem of pride. It appeared on posters, featured in art exhibitions, and became a message that respect is not a luxury, but a fundamental right of every human being. On social media, whenever people mentioned the hashtag red dress, they no longer referred only to Naomi, but also to the hundreds of women who had stepped out from the shadows to assert their worth. Naomi often told those who came to see her, "I'm not a hero, I'm just a janitor who chose not to bow her head." That simplicity only deepened people's trust. She didn't want to become an untouchable icon, but a living example that anyone, no matter where they come from, can change society if they hold on to their dignity. Looking back after a year, Naomi had not only helped hundreds of working women, but had also helped the whole society reflect on how it treats those at the very bottom. The party from that night had now become a significant milestone, often recalled as the beginning of a wider movement for justice. And in the minds of millions, one message remained clear. Ridicule can leave wounds, but courage can turn them into strength. Naomi Carter had proven that, and she continued to lead this journey, not with words alone, but with tangible action. Society had changed, but the road ahead was still long, and the red dress would continue walking forward, reminding all that justice always begins with the respect for human dignity. Charles Whitmore, over the past year, had gone through a journey unlike any other fall from grace in high society. He lost his wealth, his prestige, and the trust of even those closest to him. But in that loss, he learned a lesson he had never considered in his life: humility. Though public opinion remained divided, and many felt his apology and community fund were not enough to erase the harm he had caused, at the very least, Charles no longer carried the arrogance he once wore. He appeared at community events quietly, not on stage, but sitting in the back rows, listening. He signed funding documents for charitable projects without putting his name on any banners. The image of an aging man sitting silently in a crowd, sometimes nodding respectfully to cleaning women he once looked down on, spread as a symbol of late but genuine change. Charles knew well that he could not expect full forgiveness, because the wounds he once caused could not disappear with a few gestures of goodwill, but he accepted that as part of the sentence. Instead of trying to reclaim his former honor, he chose to walk slowly down a new path, one where he learned to listen more than speak, to share more than possess. That very silence made many people begin to see him differently. Some workers who had once turned their backs on him now nodded in acknowledgement, not to forgive, but to admit they saw a genuine change in his eyes. For Charles, that shift mattered more than any applause at the lavish parties he once basked in. He also tried to repair the damage within his family. With his son, he no longer imposed, no longer demanded legacy, but simply walked alongside him quietly. The rare evenings they shared meals were no longer weighed down by shouting, filled with gentle silence, sometimes broken by ordinary stories. Though the distance still lingered, at least Charles knew he had taken the first steps to mend the bond he himself had once severed. It was a slow journey, but he accepted the patience it required because he understood humility cannot be built in a day, but must be cultivated over a lifetime. In society's eyes, Charles, once a symbol of arrogance, had become proof that people can change as long as they dare to face the truth. That change did not make him a hero, but it made him a real human being, with all the frailty and effort of redemption. To many, he would always be someone who caused harm, but also a reminder that even the most prideful can learn to bow their heads. The story does not end only with Naomi or Charles, but with the shared message society took from it. From a cruel joke, a cleaning woman stood up and affirmed her worth, and from that fall, a once powerful man learned to start over. Two paths that once seemed destined never to meet eventually crossed at a common point: justice and dignity. It is proof that social change does not come from power or status, but from the courage to face the truth and mutual respect. And the final echo that remains from this story is not an empty slogan, but a simple truth. Strength lies not in mocking others, but in knowing how to respect them. That line became a message that spread widely, printed on posters, quoted in speeches, but more importantly, engraved in the minds of those who witnessed it. That is the greatest legacy Naomi Carter and the fall of Charles Whitmore left behind. A legacy that reminds us human dignity cannot be bought or sold, and that true strength always begins with respect. The story closes with a long journey where people must face their own truths. From the lavish party that began as a cruel joke, Naomi Carter stepped out in a red dress and turned a moment of humiliation into a striking counterblow that stunned the entire society. What seemed destined to bury her became the catalyst that brought the voices of silent laborers into the light. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore, the one who orchestrated the cruel spectacle, spiraled into loss, forced to confront loneliness, the disappointed eyes of his family, and public judgment. The arrogance that once fueled his power ultimately became the blade that severed everything. Naomi did not choose the path of fame through a superficial spotlight. She chose to remain humble, but it was her persistence and dignity that earned her the respect of an entire society. The image of the red dress became a symbol of courage, of the dignity of those once looked down upon. She led hundreds of other women out of the shadows, not to make herself the center, but so each person could find their own voice. That very act made Naomi a spreading flame, who, without a crown, carried the presence of a queen in the hearts of the people. For Charles, what seemed like an unrecoverable fall became a turning point to learn humility. From an arrogant man who never bowed his head, he had to admit his mistakes, apologize publicly, and use his own wealth to establish a fund supporting female workers. He knew full forgiveness would never fully come, but at the very least, he learned how to live truthfully, to listen instead of impose, to share instead of dominate. In loneliness and long nights of regret, Charles found something power had never given him: the peace that comes from knowing you're making amends through action. Looking at the whole picture, this is not just a story about a woman being humiliated or a wealthy man losing everything, but a reflection of a society still burdened by prejudice. It shows that true strength does not lie in wealth or power, but in dignity and justice. Naomi proved that even a cleaning woman could bring an entire system of power to its knees. And Charles proved that someone who once stood at the top, when confronted with the truth, can still change if they choose the path of humility. The lasting lesson from this story is that no one has the right to turn another person into a joke to reinforce their own status. Every individual, no matter where they come from, carries an inherent dignity that deserves respect. Contempt can leave wounds, but only courage can turn those wounds into strength that changes society. Naomi Carter rose from the lowest place to become a symbol of belief, and Charles Whitmore, from arrogance, learned the hard truth that power cannot buy respect. The final message, echoing like a reminder, is that real strength does not lie in mocking others, but in respecting them. When a society learns to value the worth of every person, from janitor to the powerful, then justice is truly served. And from this story, audiences understand that change is not some distant ideal, but can begin with a proud act, a sincere apology, or simply the courage to see one another with respect.